Welcome back, my friend. I hope you're doing well. Before we begin tonight's story, please leave a like and drop a comment. My goal is to reach 2,000 likes and 2,000 comments, and your support means a lot. Thank you for being here and supporting the channel. Now sit back, relax, and let's begin. The radio crackled to life at 5:47 a.m., pulling me from the first decent sleep I'd managed in weeks. Static filled the small cabin before Supervisor Martinez's voice cut through the white noise. "Marcus, you copy? We need you at the Kootenai Lake Station by noon. Rodriguez called in sick and we've got hikers reported missing in Sector 7. I sat up on the narrow cot, running my hands through my hair. The Kootenai Lake Station. 3 months ago, I would have jumped at the assignment. Now, after everything that happened at my last posting in Colorado, the isolation felt more like exile than opportunity. Copy that, Martinez. I'll pack up and head out within the hour. The truth was I needed this job. After the incident at Rocky Mountain National Park, where I'd supposedly suffered a psychological break according to the incident report, finding work as a park ranger had become nearly impossible. The National Park Service had quietly transferred me here to Glacier National Park, as far from populated areas as they could manage without outright firing me. They called it a therapeutic reassignment. I called it professional purgatory, but Montana was beautiful, I had to admit. The drive to Kootenai Lake took me through some of the most pristine wilderness in North America. Dense forests of Douglas fir and western hemlock pressed against the winding dirt road, their canopy so thick that even at midday dappled shadows danced across my windshield. The deeper I drove into the backcountry, the more the outside world seemed to fade away. The radio had gone silent about 20 miles back. Cell service was non-existent. This was exactly the kind of isolation that both terrified and attracted me. After what I'd experienced in Colorado, part of me craved the solitude. The other part knew that being alone with my thoughts in the wilderness was probably the last thing a man with my recent history should want. The cabin sat on the northern shore of Kootenai Lake, a pristine body of water that stretched nearly 2 miles across. The structure itself was standard Park Service issue: rough-hewn logs, a stone chimney, solar panels on the roof, and a small generator shed out back. What made this station unique was its complete isolation. The nearest ranger station was 43 miles away over rough terrain. The nearest town was over 60 miles by road. For the next 2 weeks, this would be my entire world. I unloaded my gear and conducted the standard inventory. The cabin was well stocked with emergency supplies, medical equipment, and enough food for a month. The communication equipment looked recently updated, though the backup radio was an older model that seemed to have seen better days. A logbook sat open on the wooden table, Rodriguez's neat handwriting documenting the last 3 weeks of quiet routine. Wildlife observations, weather reports, the occasional hiker check-in. The final entry was dated 2 days ago. Heard voices calling from the tree line around 2 a.m. Investigated but found no one. Possibly echo from late hikers on the far shore. I studied the entry for a long moment. Rodriguez was a 20-year veteran, not the type to jump at shadows or record irrelevant observations. If he thought voices in the night were worth documenting, there was probably something to it. The missing hikers were my immediate concern. According to the morning briefing, a couple named Jensen had failed to check in at the designated time yesterday evening. Their planned route would have brought them along the eastern shore of the lake, directly past my station. I decided to walk the shoreline before dark, looking for any signs of their passage. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the water as I began my search. The lake was mirror still, reflecting the towering peaks that surrounded the basin. This was Blackfeet territory once, before the park was established. The Kootenai tribe had also hunted these lands for generations, following game trails that were old when Lewis and Clark first mapped the region. Now it belonged to the federal government, managed by people like me who were paid to preserve its wildness while keeping it safe for visitors. I found the first sign of the missing hikers about half a mile east of the cabin. Boot prints in the soft mud near the water's edge, along with the distinctive tread pattern of expensive hiking boots. The prints headed north along the shore, exactly as their filed itinerary indicated, but something about the tracks bothered me. They seemed oddly spaced, as if the hikers had been moving erratically. Every few steps, the prints veered toward the water, then back toward the tree line, like someone following a zigzag pattern. Following the trail, I noticed other disturbing details. Broken branches at shoulder height suggested the hikers had pushed through undergrowth rather than staying on the established path. Scuff marks on rocks indicated stumbling or falling. Most concerning, I found an energy bar wrapper about a quarter mile from where the tracks started. It was torn open hastily, the contents apparently scattered rather than eaten. The trail ended abruptly at a rocky outcropping that jutted into the lake. The boot prints simply stopped, as if the hikers had vanished into thin air. I spent 20 minutes searching the area, looking for any indication of where they might have gone. No signs of struggle, no blood, no drag marks. Just nothing. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, I returned to the cabin to file my initial report. The radio worked well enough to reach the main station, though Martinez's voice came through filled with static. Any sign of the missing hikers found their trail along the eastern shore, but it ends abruptly at the rocky point about a quarter mile past marker 7. No signs of struggle, but their movement pattern was erratic. Recommend sending a search team at first light. Copy that. Weather Service is calling for a front to move in tomorrow night, so we'll get a team out there as soon as possible. You'll coordinate from your station. After signing off, I prepared a simple dinner and settled in for the night. The cabin was comfortable enough, with a wood-burning stove that took the chill off the mountain air. I tried to read a paperback novel I'd brought, but my attention kept drifting to the windows that looked out over the dark lake. Around 10 p.m. I heard the first voice. It was faint, barely audible over the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. A woman's voice, calling out what sounded like "help me" from somewhere across the water. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the small porch, scanning the lake's surface with the beam. Nothing but darkness and the occasional flash of reflected starlight on the water. The voice came again, clearer this time. Definitely a woman, definitely calling for help. But the acoustics were wrong somehow. Sound carries well over water, especially on a still night like this, but the voice seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Sometimes from the north shore, sometimes from the south, sometimes from directly out on the water itself. I tried the radio, but got only static. The backup unit was equally useless. Protocol dictated that I should attempt a rescue, even if it meant going out on the water alone. But something about the situation felt wrong. The erratic nature of the voice's location, the complete lack of visual confirmation, the way the calls seemed almost rhythmic, like they were being repeated rather than shouted in genuine distress. Rodriguez's logbook entry came back to me. Heard voices calling from the tree line around 2 a.m. Against my better judgment, I decided to wait until morning. If someone was genuinely in distress out there, they would continue calling and I could mount a proper rescue operation in daylight. If it was something else, well, I'd learned in Colorado that not every sound in the wilderness was what it seemed to be. The calls continued sporadically throughout the night, always just distant enough that I couldn't quite make out the words, always from a slightly different location. Each time I was tempted to investigate, I reminded myself of the missing hikers whose erratic trail had ended at the water's edge. Whatever had happened to them, I didn't want to follow in their footsteps. As dawn broke over Kootenai Lake, the voices finally stopped. But my real education in the sounds of the wilderness was just beginning. Chapter 2. Echoes and Answers. The second day began with a discovery that made my blood run cold. During my morning perimeter check, I found fresh boot prints leading up from the lake to my cabin. They weren't mine. The tread pattern was completely different and they were smaller, like a woman's hiking boots. The prints circled the cabin twice before heading back toward the water, where they disappeared at the rocky shoreline. Someone had been watching me while I slept. I documented the prints with photos and measurements, then immediately tried to raise Martinez on the radio. Static. The backup radio produced nothing but an electronic whine that hurt my ears. Even the emergency satellite beacon showed a connection error when I tested it. For the first time since arriving at Kootenai Lake, I felt truly isolated. The missing hikers were named Patricia and Michael Jensen according to their permit files. I'd found their paperwork in the cabin's administrative folder, along with copies of their identification and emergency contact information. Patricia was 34, a software engineer from Seattle. Michael was 36, a graphic designer. They'd been married 8 years, according to the forms, and this was their annual anniversary hiking trip. Looking at their photos, I felt a chill of recognition. Patricia's hiking boots matched the prints I'd found around the cabin that morning, but Patricia Jensen had been missing for over 36 hours. I spent the morning conducting a more thorough search of the immediate area, looking for any signs that the couple might have made camp nearby. Standard procedure in missing persons cases was to assume the subjects were still alive and trying to signal for help. The voices I'd heard during the night could have been Patricia calling for rescue while Michael was injured somewhere nearby. The theory made sense until I found their campsite. It was located in a small clearing about half a mile north of where their trail had ended, hidden from casual observation by a thick stand of pine trees. The site had been used recently. There were still cold ashes and a makeshift fire ring, along with scattered gear that included sleeping bags, a camp stove, and food supplies. But the scene was all wrong. The sleeping bags were shredded as if something had torn through them with claws. The camp stove was overturned and dented. Food packages were scattered across the ground, but nothing had been eaten. Most disturbing, there were no signs that the campers had packed up and left voluntarily. Personal items were strewn everywhere. Clothes, toiletries, a GPS unit with a cracked screen, and Patricia's wallet with her identification still inside. But no bodies, no blood, no drag marks leading away from the site. I photographed everything and collected what evidence I could, including the damaged GPS unit. If I could get it working, it might show me their movements before they disappeared. The wallet I left untouched. Tampering with evidence wasn't part of my job description, and I wanted to preserve the scene for the search team that would hopefully arrive soon. The hike back to the cabin gave me time to think. 2 people don't just vanish without a trace, especially not experienced hikers who knew to file proper permits and follow established procedures. The condition of their campsite suggested some kind of attack. But what kind of predator shreds sleeping bags without leaving blood? Bears typically make a mess when they raid campsites, but they're interested in food, not fabric. And bears don't usually attack without provocation. The voice calling for help during the night took on a more sinister quality in light of what I'd discovered. If Patricia Jensen was dead or seriously injured, what had I been hearing? Audio hallucinations weren't uncommon in people under stress, especially in isolated environments. After my psychological evaluation in Colorado, I was officially prone to perceptual disturbances under certain conditions, but the boot prints around my cabin were real. I had photographs. Late afternoon brought visitors of a sort I hadn't expected. I was updating my incident report when I heard voices outside the cabin. Not the mysterious calls from across the water, but clear conversation from people approaching through the trees. My first thought was relief. The search team had arrived earlier than expected. I stepped onto the porch and called out a greeting, but the voices stopped immediately. The forest fell completely silent, which was unusual even for late afternoon. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no wind through the trees. Just oppressive, heavy silence. "Hello?" I called again. "This is Ranger Marcus at Kootenai Lake Station. If you're part of the search team, please identify yourselves." The silence stretched on for nearly a minute. Then, from somewhere in the trees to my left, I heard Patricia Jensen's voice. "Help me, please. I'm hurt and I can't find Michael." The voice was clear and close, maybe 30 yards away through the undergrowth. But I'd just come from her destroyed campsite. I'd seen her scattered belongings, the evidence of whatever had attacked them. Patricia Jensen was almost certainly dead. "Where are you?" I called back, playing along while my hand moved to the bear spray on my belt. "I'm a park ranger. I can help you." "I'm lost," came the reply. But now the voice seemed to come from a different direction entirely. "I've been walking for hours. Please help me." I stepped off the porch and moved toward where the first call had originated, but found nothing. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no sign that anyone had been there. The voice called again, pleading for help, but now it came from behind me, near the cabin. This continued for nearly 10 minutes. Patricia's voice, always desperate, always pleading, but moving constantly around the perimeter of the clearing. Never from the same location twice, never close enough that I could pinpoint the source. I tried to follow the sound several times, but it always seemed to stay just out of sight, just beyond the next tree or boulder. The most unsettling part was how accurate the voice sounded. Not just the words, but the tone, the inflection, even what sounded like genuine distress. If I hadn't seen the destroyed campsite with my own eyes, I would have believed I was listening to a real person in genuine need of help. Finally, I stopped playing the game. Standing in the center of the clearing, I called out to the forest around me. "I know you're not Patricia Jensen. I found your campsite. I know what happened to you. Whatever you are, stop using her voice." The forest fell silent again. Then, from directly behind me, so close I could feel breath on my neck, Patricia's voice whispered, "Please help me." I spun around, bear spray ready, but found nothing. Just the evening shadows growing longer across the empty clearing. That night I barricaded the cabin door and kept my rifle within arm's reach. The voices started again around midnight, but this time they were different. Instead of cries for help, I heard what sounded like normal conversation from multiple people outside the cabin walls. There was Patricia's voice, discussing hiking plans with someone who sounded like Michael. A third voice I didn't recognize talking about the weather. A fourth voice, deeper, that seemed to be giving directions to the lake. The conversations overlapped and intertwined, creating the impression of a group of campers settled in for the night just outside my door. But when I looked through the windows, I saw nothing but darkness. The talking continued until dawn, sometimes so clear it seemed like the speakers were sitting right outside on the porch. I caught fragments of conversation that chilled me to the bone. Planning tomorrow's hike, discussing what they'd found in the woods, talking about the ranger in the cabin and whether he was asleep yet. When sunrise finally came, I found fresh tracks circling the cabin again. Not just Patricia's boots this time, but 3 other sets of prints, different sizes, different tread patterns, as if an entire group had spent the night walking around and around the building while carrying on their casual conversations. But the tracks told a story that human feet couldn't tell. The stride length was wrong, too long for the size of the prints. The depth was inconsistent, sometimes pressing deep into the earth, sometimes barely leaving an impression. And strangest of all, some of the tracks showed only partial prints, as if the feet making them weren't quite the right shape for the boots they were wearing. I knew then that whatever was out there wasn't human, but it was learning to sound human, and it was getting better at the imitation each night. Chapter 3, The Watchers. Day 3 brought snow, even though it was still early September. I woke to find the cabin surrounded by a thin white blanket that had fallen silently during the night. The weather change should have been beautiful. Fresh snow in the mountains always was. But this felt ominous. The flakes were still coming down, large and wet, clinging to the trees and turning the world into a muffled monochrome landscape. More concerning was what the snow revealed. The tracks around the cabin weren't just from the 4 sets of feet I'd identified the previous morning. There were dozens of impressions layered on top of each other as if a crowd had gathered during the night. Some tracks were human-sized, but others were wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. Too long, too narrow, with what looked like claw marks where toes should be. But the most disturbing discovery was the arrangement of the tracks. They didn't form the random pattern I'd expect from animals investigating the cabin. Instead, they created deliberate circles spiraling inward toward the building like some kind of ritual formation. At the center of the spiral, directly in front of the main door, someone or something had arranged a collection of objects. Patricia Jensen's GPS unit, Michael's camp stove, a torn piece of fabric that looked like it came from their destroyed tent, and something I didn't recognize at first. It was a section of tree bark that had been carefully carved with symbols. Not random scratches, but deliberate markings that formed what looked almost like a crude map. Lines intersected at specific points, with small circles marking locations along what might have been the lakeshore. At the center of the carved map was a symbol that made my stomach turn. It looked like a human figure with its mouth wide open, as if screaming or calling out. I photographed everything before disturbing the scene, though I doubted the images would mean anything to investigators if I ever managed to get them out of here. The radio was still dead, producing nothing but static and electronic noise when I tried to raise the main station. Even worse, the backup battery system was showing signs of drain, despite being fully charged when I'd arrived. Something was drawing power from the cabin's electrical systems. The carved bark went into my evidence collection, along with detailed notes about the track patterns and their apparent ritualistic arrangement. If these things were intelligent enough to create maps and arrange objects in symbolic patterns, they were far more dangerous than simple predators. They were planning something. The snow made tracking easier, but also more unnerving. I could follow the inhuman footprints as they led away from the cabin, heading in multiple directions through the forest. Some tracks went toward the lake, others deeper into the woods. But the most heavily traveled path led north toward the rocky cliffs that formed the basin's northern wall. Following the northern trail, I discovered why this area had been chosen for their gathering. Hidden behind a screen of evergreen trees was a natural amphitheater, a semicircular depression in the rock face that created perfect acoustics. Standing at the center, I could hear my own voice echo clearly off the surrounding stone. A whisper spoken here would carry clearly to anyone positioned at the rim of the depression, nearly 50 yards away. The floor of the amphitheater was covered with more tracks, these older and partially filled with snow from previous storms. Whatever these things were, they'd been using this location for weeks, possibly months. Arranged around the perimeter were more carved symbols, these etched directly into the rock face. The workmanship was crude but consistent, suggesting the same intelligence that had created the bark map. More disturbing were the objects scattered around the amphitheater floor. Pieces of clothing, camping gear, personal items that clearly belonged to hikers. A child's stuffed animal, weather-beaten but recognizable. A hiking boot with something dark stained on the leather. A pair of eyeglasses with one lens missing. And worst of all, a collection of wallets and identification cards tucked into a natural crevice in the rock wall like trophies. I counted 17 different IDs, representing missing persons cases that probably stretched back years. The most recent was Patricia Jensen's driver's license, the one I'd seen in her wallet at the campsite. But there were others, including several from the previous hiking season and one that was dated nearly 5 years ago. The Jensen case wasn't an isolated incident. These things had been hunting hikers in this area for years, and somehow their disappearances had gone unnoticed or unreported. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't dealing with a recent threat that had mysteriously appeared. This was an established predator that had turned this entire region into its hunting ground. The carved symbols began to make more sense when I studied them in context. They weren't random markings but a crude documentation system. Each symbol corresponded to a different hunting method or location. The screaming figure I'd seen that morning represented vocal mimicry, their ability to imitate human voices and lure victims. Other symbols showed figures near water, in trees, or surrounded by what looked like animal shapes. But the most chilling discovery was a symbol that appeared repeatedly throughout the collection. A simplified drawing of a cabin, with human figures arranged in a circle around it. Below this symbol was a tally mark system, with dozens of small vertical lines grouped in sets of 5. They were counting something, and my cabin was part of their system. The walk back through the falling snow gave me time to process what I'd learned. These creatures, whatever they were, had developed a complex hunting strategy based on vocal mimicry and psychological manipulation. They studied their prey, learned their voices, and used that knowledge to separate victims from groups and lead them into ambush situations. The amphitheater was probably where they practiced their imitations, refining their ability to copy specific voices and accents, but they were also patient. The evidence suggested they'd been operating in this area for years without being detected. They understood enough about human behavior to clean up after themselves, removing bodies and evidence that might attract attention. The fact that 17 people had disappeared without triggering a major investigation meant they were careful about who they targeted and when. My presence at the cabin had disrupted their normal pattern. Instead of hunters passing through their territory, they now had a permanent resident to deal with. The nightly visits, the circling tracks, the arranged objects, these weren't random harassment. They were studying me, learning my routines, and preparing for something. The snow was falling harder by the time I reached the cabin, and visibility was dropping rapidly. Weather this early in the season usually meant a brief system that would move through quickly, but the temperature was continuing to drop. If this developed into a real storm, I could be trapped here for days with no communication and dwindling supplies. As I prepared dinner, I noticed something that made my hands shake. The carved bark map I'd collected that morning was gone from where I'd placed it on the table. The cabin door was still locked, the windows were secure, and I'd been gone for less than 3 hours. But the evidence had simply vanished. They could get inside whenever they wanted. That evening, I didn't wait for the voices to start. As soon as darkness fell, I called out to the forest around the cabin. "I know you're out there. I found your hunting ground. I know how many people you've killed." The response came immediately, but it wasn't Patricia's voice this time. It was my own voice, speaking words I'd never said. "Help me," my own voice called from the tree line. "I'm lost and I can't find my way back to the station." Then Michael's voice joined in. "There's a ranger missing. We need to organize a search party." More voices followed, each one perfectly mimicked from conversations they must have overheard or victims they'd studied. But they were all saying the same thing, building a chorus of calls for help and rescue that would draw any potential searchers directly into their ambush. They weren't just learning to hunt individuals. They were learning to hunt rescue teams. I spent that night listening to my own voice call for help from the darkness outside, knowing that if anyone came looking for me, they would follow those familiar calls straight into the hands of whatever was waiting in the woods around Kootenai Lake. Chapter 4. The hunger in their voices. The fourth day dawned with an unnatural silence that set my nerves on edge immediately. The snow had stopped falling, but the world outside the cabin windows looked wrong somehow. The trees stood too still, their branches heavy with snow but motionless despite the usual morning breeze that came off the lake. Even the water was perfectly calm, reflecting the gray sky like a mirror that had been placed there by some cosmic designer. But the most unsettling change was the absence of tracks. The snow around the cabin was pristine, unmarked by any footprints or disturbances. After 3 nights of evidence that I was being watched and circled, the sudden lack of activity felt more threatening than reassuring. They hadn't given up, they were waiting for something. Inside the cabin, more of my collected evidence had disappeared. The photographs I'd taken of the amphitheater were gone from my camera's memory card, though the earlier pictures from the Jensen campsite remained untouched. Someone or something had selectively deleted specific images while leaving others intact. The level of discrimination required for such an action suggested intelligence far beyond what I'd initially assumed. My morning radio check produced a new horror. Instead of static, I heard voices on every frequency, not the electronic chatter of other ranger stations or emergency services, but the copied voices of missing hikers calling for help. Patricia's voice begging for rescue on Channel 7, Michael describing his injuries on Channel 12. My own voice reporting a false emergency on the primary ranger frequency, giving coordinates that would lead any responding units directly toward the amphitheater. They were using the radio system against me, broadcasting false distress calls that would bring more victims into their hunting ground. Worse, anyone monitoring the channels would hear what sounded like legitimate emergency traffic and respond accordingly. I was listening to the setup for a massacre. I tried to override the false broadcasts with legitimate warnings, but my transmissions were immediately drowned out by a cacophony of copied voices all talking at once. The creatures had learned enough about radio protocol to jam my communications while maintaining their own false signals. They were adapting to human technology faster than I could counter their strategies. The isolation was becoming absolute. No radio contact, no cell service, no emergency beacon response. The road back to the main station was impassable due to the early snow, and my ATV was showing signs of tampering. Someone had removed crucial engine components during the night, leaving the machine inoperable. I was trapped at Kootenai Lake with creatures that were systematically eliminating every possible means of escape or communication, but they were also getting bolder. Around noon, I saw the first direct visual contact. It was standing at the edge of the tree line across the lake, perfectly motionless among the snow-covered pines. At first glance, it looked like a person in hiking gear, the right height and build, wearing what appeared to be a backpack and winter clothing, but something about its posture was wrong. It stood too straight, too still, like a scarecrow that had been positioned to watch the cabin. I grabbed binoculars and focused on the figure. The details I could make out were nightmare fuel. It was wearing Patricia Jensen's bright red jacket, but the garment hung wrong on its frame, as if the body underneath wasn't quite the right shape. The face was turned toward the cabin, but from this distance I couldn't make out features. What I could see was that it never moved. Not a shift in weight, not an adjustment to its position, Not even the slight sway that comes from breathing. It simply stood and watched for 3 hours. When I looked again around 3 p.m., it was gone. But now there were two figures visible at different points around the lake's perimeter. One stood near the rocky outcropping where the Jensen Trail had ended, wearing what looked like Michael's blue hiking jacket. The other was positioned at the mouth of the trail that led to the amphitheater, too far away to make out details but clearly maintaining the same unnatural stillness as the first watcher. They were taking positions, surrounding the lake and cutting off potential escape routes. The siege was becoming obvious, and they were no longer bothering to hide their presence. That afternoon brought a discovery that explained much about their behavior patterns. While searching the cabin more thoroughly for signs of their intrusion, I found a loose floorboard near the back wall. Underneath was a hidden space that contained a journal, obviously left by previous rangers who had encountered the same phenomena. The journal entries went back nearly 8 years, written by different hands but documenting similar experiences. Voices in the night, missing hikers, false radio broadcasts, and gradually escalating psychological pressure. But the most revealing entries were the most recent, written by Rodriguez during his final weeks at the station. Day 12. They're getting better at the voices. Today I heard my own mother calling for help from across the lake. She's been dead for 6 years, but they somehow found her voice in my head and copied it perfectly. Day 15. Found evidence they've been inside the cabin while I sleep. Personal items moved, food consumed, pages torn from this journal. They're studying me, learning my habits and fears. Day 18. The radio broadcasts are spreading. Heard false distress calls on frequencies from stations over 200 miles away. Whatever these things are, they're not limited to this location. They're part of something larger. Day 21. Can't tell what's real anymore. They've started copying voices of people I know are still alive, having conversations that sound like normal radio chatter from the main station. But when I try to respond, the voices turn to laughter. The final entry was dated the day before Rodriguez had supposedly called in sick. They want me to leave voluntarily. All the psychological pressure, the isolation, the constant fear, it's designed to make me request a transfer. But I found something in the amphitheater that changes everything. They're not just hunting individuals, they're building something. And if I leave now, the next ranger won't know what's coming. Rodriguez hadn't called in sick. He'd been taken just like the hikers, and I was his replacement, walking blindly into the same trap. But he'd hidden something for the next ranger to find. According to his notes, there was a cache of supplies and information hidden in a specific location near the amphitheater, marked by a cairn of 3 stacked stones. If I could reach it after dark, I might learn what Rodriguez had discovered about their larger purpose. As evening approached, the watchers around the lake multiplied. I counted at least 6 figures positioned at strategic points, all wearing clothing that belonged to missing hikers. They maintained their unnatural stillness, but I noticed they were gradually moving closer to the cabin as darkness fell. The voices started earlier that night, beginning as soon as the sun disappeared behind the western peaks. But instead of the usual calls for help or mimicked conversations, I heard something that made my blood freeze. They were copying the radio traffic from earlier in the day, replaying my attempts to send warnings and their jamming responses. But they were modifying the playback, editing it to create new meanings. My voice, altered and spliced together from previous transmissions. This is Ranger Marcus. I've suffered a complete psychological breakdown. I've been hearing voices and seeing things that aren't there. I need immediate evacuation and psychiatric evaluation. Rodriguez's voice, somehow copied despite his disappearance. Confirmed psychological instability. Ranger Marcus is a danger to himself and others. Recommend termination of employment and permanent restriction from Park Service. They were creating an audio record that would explain my disappearance or death as the result of mental illness. Anyone who eventually found these recordings would conclude that I'd suffered the same psychological break that had supposedly ended my career in Colorado. The creatures weren't just hunting. They were covering their tracks with sophisticated psychological warfare. Around midnight, I made my move toward the amphitheater. The watchers had maintained their positions around the lake, but they seemed focused on the cabin itself rather than monitoring the entire perimeter. Using a route that took me along the shoreline and then through dense timber, I managed to reach the amphitheater without direct confrontation. Rodriguez's cache was where his notes indicated, hidden beneath a cairn of stones near the far edge of the natural depression. Inside a waterproof container, I found additional journals, photographs, and a collection of audio recordings that made everything clear. The creatures weren't just mimicking human voices. They were absorbing them, somehow extracting vocal patterns and speech memories from their victims. The recording showed the progression of their abilities over time, starting with crude imitations and evolving into perfect reproductions that included not just voices but specific knowledge, memories, and personality traits. But the most chilling discovery was a map that showed the scope of their operations. Red marks indicated disappearances throughout the Rocky Mountain region, concentrated around remote areas with limited communication access. The pattern suggested a coordinated network of hunting groups, all using similar tactics but operating across hundreds of miles of wilderness. Kootenai Lake wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic colonization of wilderness areas by creatures that were learning to replace human beings one voice at a time. The photographs in the cache showed the creatures without their stolen clothing. They were humanoid but wrong in every detail that mattered. Too tall, with joints that bent in directions that shouldn't have been possible. Pale, almost translucent skin that seemed to shimmer in camera flashes, and faces that were smooth and featureless except for mouths that could open impossibly wide, like acoustic caverns designed specifically for reproducing sound. Rodriguez's final notes explained what they were building in the amphitheater. Not just a practice space for vocal mimicry, but a breeding ground where they could teach their offspring to hunt humans. The stone carvings weren't just records of past hunts. They were instructional materials for the next generation, and breeding season was about to begin. Chapter 5. The Last Voice. The fifth dawn brought them out of hiding completely. I counted 13 figures positioned around the lake, no longer bothering with concealment or stillness. They moved with purpose now, closing the circle around the cabin in deliberate stages. Some walked upright with human gaits, others moved on all fours with liquid grace that spoke of their true nature. All wore clothing taken from their victims, creating a grotesque parade of the missing and dead. The radio had become a weapon turned against me. Every frequency now carried a constant stream of false communications designed to create maximum psychological impact. I heard my own voice pleading for rescue, Rodriguez describing my dangerous mental state, and Patricia Jensen sobbing as she supposedly watched me threaten her with violence. The broadcasts were being coordinated to tell a specific story. The tale of a ranger who had lost his mind and murdered the hikers he was supposed to protect. But the most insidious aspect of their psychological warfare was how they used the voices of people from my past. My ex-wife Sarah, describing how I'd always been unstable. My former supervisor from Colorado, detailing the incident that had ended my career there. Even my mother, who had died 3 years ago, expressing her disappointment in the man I'd become. They were mining my deepest fears and regrets, somehow accessing memories and emotional wounds that I'd never shared with anyone. The level of psychological penetration was impossible unless they possessed abilities far beyond vocal mimicry. They were reading my mind, extracting the raw material for their torture directly from my subconscious. The cache of supplies Rodriguez had left included a detailed plan for escape, but it required precise timing and considerable luck. According to his observations, the creatures maintained their positions around the lake during daylight hours but concentrated near the amphitheater for some kind of communal activity each night between 2 and 4 a.m. During that window, it might be possible to reach the emergency ATV he'd hidden on the far side of the lake and escape toward the main road. But escape wasn't my only consideration anymore. The radio broadcasts were being transmitted across a wide area, potentially drawing other rangers and search teams into the trap. My duty as a Park Service employee required me to prevent additional casualties, even if it meant sacrificing my own chances of survival. The solution came from studying Rodriguez's audio recordings more carefully. The creature's mimicry abilities had one crucial weakness. They could only reproduce sounds they had previously absorbed from victims. They couldn't create original content, only recombine and edit existing vocal patterns. This meant their false radio broadcasts, convincing as they sounded, were built from a finite library of stolen voices and phrases. If I could overwhelm that library with contradictory information, I might be able to disrupt their communication network long enough to send a genuine warning to the outside world. I spent the morning preparing for what would essentially be a vocal battle against creatures that had been perfecting sound-based warfare for years. Using the cabin's PA system and every recording device I could find, I began broadcasting a continuous stream of contradictory statements, false confessions, and deliberately confusing information. The goal was to flood their mimicry abilities with so much conflicting data that they couldn't maintain coherent false narratives. This is Ranger Marcus. I am mentally stable and in immediate danger from unknown hostiles. This is Ranger Marcus. I have discovered evidence of multiple homicides in the Kootenai Lake area. This is Ranger Marcus. The missing hikers are dead, and their killers are still in the area. This is Ranger Marcus. Do not send search teams to these coordinates. Repeat, do not approach Kootenai Lake. I recorded dozens of variations, playing them back at high volume while simultaneously broadcasting on every radio frequency I could access. The creature's response was immediate and violent. The false broadcasts became chaotic, with multiple versions of my voice contradicting each other and creating an incomprehensible cacophony of conflicting information. More significantly, the watchers around the lake began to move erratically, their coordinated positioning breaking down as they apparently struggled to process the overload of confusing data. Whatever network they used for communication was being disrupted by the contradictory information I was feeding into their system, but my electronic warfare had consequences I hadn't anticipated. As their communication network degraded, the creatures became more aggressive in their direct approach. Instead of maintaining their patient siege, they began advancing on the cabin in broad daylight. The first one reached the porch around 2 p.m. Up close, the disguise was obviously false. Patricia Jensen's jacket hung on a frame that was too tall and too narrow, the sleeves bulging in places where joints bent at impossible angles. The face beneath the stolen hiking cap was smooth and featureless except for a mouth that opened wider than any human jaw could manage. It spoke with Patricia's voice, but the words were wrong. "Help me, help me, help me, help me," repeated endlessly like a broken recording. Behind it, I could see others approaching from multiple directions, all moving with the same unnatural gait and speaking in the voices of their victims. The siege was ending. The final assault had begun. I grabbed Rodriguez's emergency supplies and retreated to the cabin's back room, where he'd prepared a defensive position with clear sight lines and multiple escape routes. The creatures didn't try to break down the door. They simply opened it and walked inside, as if they'd always had access to the building. What followed was the most surreal gunfight of my life. I fired at targets that moved like liquid shadows, that absorbed bullets without apparent damage, that spoke in the voices of people I'd known while trying to tear me apart with claws that could shred human flesh like paper. My shots scattered them temporarily, but they regrouped and advanced again with mechanical persistence. The only thing that seemed to genuinely affect them was fire. When my third shot ignited the propane camping stove, creating a wall of flame between us, they recoiled with what might have been actual fear. The smooth faces turned toward the fire with something approaching recognition, and they withdrew to the main room, but they didn't leave. Instead, they began to sing. It started as a low humming that seemed to come from all directions at once. Then individual voices joined in, creating harmonies that no human choir could produce. The song had no words, but it carried meaning on a level below conscious thought. It spoke of hunger that stretched across geological time, of intelligence that predated human civilization, of patience that could wait centuries for the right moment to feed. As the singing continued, I began to understand what they really were. Not individual creatures, but fragments of something larger, pieces of a distributed consciousness that used vocal mimicry to fragment and absorb human identity. They weren't just killing people, they were stealing their voices, their memories, their essential selves, and adding them to a collective entity that grew stronger with each victim. The song was an invitation to join them voluntarily, to stop fighting and let them add my voice to their chorus. The alternative was to have my identity torn away piece by piece until nothing remained but another empty shell wearing my clothes and speaking my words. I chose fire. Rodriguez's emergency supplies included enough accelerant to turn the entire cabin into a funeral pyre. As the creatures continued their hypnotic song, I doused every surface with camping fuel and prepared for the only escape that remained available. The explosion that followed lit up Kootenai Lake like a second sunrise. By the time the flames died down, nothing remained of the cabin but smoking foundation stones and the blackened remnants of a wood stove. But I survived, hidden in the emergency shelter Rodriguez had prepared beneath the cabin's floor. The creatures had withdrawn when the fire started, apparently unable or unwilling to risk exposure to the intense heat. Their fear of fire might have been instinctual, or it might have been learned from previous encounters with humans who had chosen immolation over absorption. I emerged 3 days later, when the last of the flames had died and the ashes had cooled. The watchers were gone, the false radio broadcasts had stopped, and the forest around Kootenai Lake had returned to normal. Birds sang in the trees, small animals rustled through the underbrush, and the lake itself reflected the autumn sky with natural beauty. But I knew they were still out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness of Glacier National Park. Rodriguez's map had shown the scope of their operations, and destroying one hunting ground wouldn't eliminate the larger threat. They would relocate, adapt, and continue their patient campaign to replace human voices with their own. The long walk back to civilization gave me time to plan my next moves. The official report would describe a tragic accident, a propane explosion that destroyed the cabin and claimed the life of Ranger Marcus while he was investigating the disappearance of 2 hikers. The false radio broadcasts they'd created would support this narrative, painting me as mentally unstable and potentially dangerous. But Rodriguez had prepared for this possibility. Hidden caches throughout the park contained evidence that would eventually expose the truth if someone knew where to look. Maps of hunting grounds, recordings of the creatures' true voices, photographs that showed their real forms. The information was there for someone with the knowledge and determination to find it. I never returned to Park Service employment. The official investigation concluded that I had died in the cabin explosion, and Marcus the Ranger was buried in an empty coffin with full honors. The man who walked out of Glacier National Park that October was someone else entirely. Someone with a new mission and the skills Rodriguez had provided to carry it out. The creatures that haunt our wilderness areas are real. They hunt with voices stolen from the dead, using our own words against us in an ancient war that most people never realize is being fought. They are patient, intelligent, and completely without mercy, but they can be fought. They can be killed. And for every voice they steal, someone needs to be there to remember the person who once owned it. I am that someone now. And this is the warning I leave for whoever finds this account. When you hear familiar voices calling from the darkness of the wilderness, don't trust what you hear. The dead have nothing left to say, and the living rarely call for help from places where no help can reach. The hunt continues, but now they are the prey, and I am learning to speak their language. My name is Riley Thompson, and I used to think the worst thing about living in Detroit was the mounting stack of medical bills on my kitchen table. That was before I learned about the things that hunt in America's forgotten places. I was 28, drowning in debt from my mother's cancer treatment, working 2 jobs just to keep our heads above water. The auto plant had laid me off 6 months prior, and my weekend shifts at the diner barely covered rent on our cramped apartment in Corktown. Mom's chemotherapy had drained our savings, and even with insurance, the copays were crushing us. I spent my evenings reading rejection letters from employers who wanted experience I didn't have, or qualifications I couldn't afford to obtain. That Tuesday morning in March, when the temperature hovered just above freezing and dirty snow clung to Detroit's potholed streets, I was refilling coffee for the breakfast crowd when he walked in. The man wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months, and his pale eyes scanned the diner with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to cataloging threats. "Riley Thompson?" His voice carried the flat neutrality of bureaucracy. I set down the coffee pot, suddenly aware of the grease stains on my uniform. "Yeah, that's me. You're not here about the student loans, are you?" He slid into booth 7, the one with the torn vinyl seat that we never seemed to get around to fixing. "Agent Warren Blackwood, Department of Interior. I'd like to discuss a career opportunity." The Department of Interior. I knew enough to recognize federal authority when it introduced itself, but this felt different. Agent Blackwood's credentials looked legitimate. But something in his manner suggested layers beneath the surface that weren't listed on any organizational chart. "I don't know anything about park management," I said, though I poured him coffee anyway. It was habit more than hospitality. "This isn't about parks." He opened a manila folder and withdrew several photographs. "Tell me, Miss Thompson, what do you know about missing persons cases in remote wilderness areas?" The photos showed families, hikers, hunters, ordinary people with ordinary smiles, frozen in moments before they vanished. Some of the images were recent, but others had the faded quality of decades past. What struck me wasn't their ordinariness, but the locations listed beneath each photo. Remote forests in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, Oregon's Cascade Range, Pennsylvania's state game lands, Wisconsin's North Woods, North Carolina's Appalachian Wilderness. "People get lost hiking," I said, though even as I spoke, something about the photos unsettled me. There were too many of them, spanning too many years, and the missing persons shared a peculiar similarity in their expressions. A distant look, as though they were already partially elsewhere when the photos were taken. Agent Blackwood's laugh held no humor. "Miss Thompson, in the past 50 years, over 40,000 people have vanished in America's wilderness areas under circumstances that defy conventional explanation. They disappear from well-marked trails in perfect weather. Search dogs lose their scent at impossible locations. Experienced outdoorsmen abandon their equipment and walk into terrain that should have killed them within hours." I slid into the booth across from him, abandoning any pretense of working. "You're talking about some kind of conspiracy theory." "I'm talking about a pattern that requires investigation by individuals with specific qualifications." He studied me with those pale eyes. "You served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a communications specialist. You're trained in wilderness survival, have experience with hostile environments, and according to your psychological evaluations, you maintain rational thinking under extreme stress." The fact that he knew about my military service wasn't surprising. It was public record. But the psychological evaluations were classified, and his casual reference to them suggested access to files that should have been sealed. "Most importantly," he continued, "you're in desperate need of steady employment with comprehensive health benefits." My mother's medical bills seemed to pulse with renewed urgency in the back of my mind. "What exactly are you offering?" "A position with the Federal Bureau of Wilderness Recovery. Officially, we're a small subdivision of the Forest Service focused on search and rescue operations. Unofficially, we investigate disappearances that fall outside normal parameters. The starting salary is $78,000 annually, with full medical coverage for you and immediate family members." The number hit me like a physical blow. It was more than double what I'd made at the plant. Enough to cover Mom's treatment and maybe even get us out of debt. But nothing in life came without a cost, especially not offers that seemed too good to be true. "What's the catch?" Agent Blackwood closed the folder. "The work is dangerous. Our operatives face threats that aren't acknowledged in any official capacity. You would be required to sign extensive non-disclosure agreements, and your missions would take you to some of the most isolated locations in the continental United States. The psychological toll can be significant." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a business card. "If you're interested, report to this address tomorrow at 8 a.m. Bring a duffel bag with essentials for a 2-week training period. Don't tell anyone where you're going." After he left, I stood in the empty diner holding his card, studying the address printed in simple black text. No department logo, no official seals, just coordinates that led somewhere in Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains. That evening, I sat at Mom's bedside in the oncology ward, watching her sleep beneath the tangle of IV lines that had become her constant companions. The medical bills were stacked on her nightstand, each statement a reminder of how quickly hope could be measured in dollars and cents. She'd been fighting for 2 years, enduring treatments that left her weak and hollow-eyed, all while pretending to be strong for my sake. "There's a job opportunity," I told her when she woke. "Federal work. Good money, good benefits." She studied my face with the intuition that only comes from raising a child through every conceivable crisis. "But you're scared of it." "I'm scared of what happens if I don't take it." Mom reached for my hand with fingers that felt fragile as bird bones. "Riley, I've lived a good life. Don't make choices out of fear for me that you'll regret later." But fear was all I had left. Fear of losing her, fear of the debt that would follow me for decades, Fear of returning to the plant if they'd even take me back. At least this fear came with a salary and the possibility of making a difference even if I didn't understand what that difference might be. I packed that night, including the camping gear from my army days and enough clothes for 2 weeks in uncertain conditions. As I sealed the duffel bag, I tried to ignore the voice in the back of my mind that whispered this felt less like accepting a job and more like volunteering for something I didn't yet comprehend. The next morning, I drove south through Virginia's winding mountain roads, following coordinates to a facility that didn't appear on any map. The building was unremarkable, concrete and glass nestled between ridgelines with no signs or markings to indicate its purpose. But the security checkpoint and the armed guards suggested this was more than a typical government office. Agent Blackwood met me in the parking lot, now dressed in tactical gear that made his true nature more apparent. "Welcome to the Bureau of Wilderness Recovery, Miss Thompson. For the next 2 weeks, you'll undergo training that will prepare you for field work unlike anything in your military experience." As I followed him through the facility's sterile corridors, I caught glimpses of other trainees engaged in exercises that seemed to blend traditional search and rescue techniques with something far more ominous. In one room, a team studied photographs of footprints that appeared to shift and blur when viewed directly. In another, operatives practiced radio procedures while listening to recordings of voices that seemed to come from impossible distances. "One question before we begin," I said as we reached the briefing room. "What am I actually going to be hunting out there?" Agent Blackwood paused at the door, and for the first time his professional composure cracked slightly. "Miss Thompson, the American wilderness is older than our civilization, and there are things in those remote places that were never meant to be found. Our job isn't to hunt them. Our job is to find the people who encounter them and bring back whoever we can save." He opened the door to reveal a room full of maps marked with red pins, each one representing a location where someone had vanished into the vast, unknowing darkness between the trees. As I stared at those clustered marks, I realized I was no longer just accepting a job. I was enlisting in a war against forces that existed in the margins of human understanding. The training began that afternoon, and with it my education in the terrible things that wait in America's forgotten places. 3 weeks later, I found myself crouched in the Michigan wilderness, watching my breath cloud in the October air while Agent Curtis Manning checked his GPS coordinates for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. The trees around us were a riot of autumn colors, beautiful in the way that only preceded the long death of winter. "Signal still inconsistent," Curtis muttered, tapping the device's screen. He was 10 years my senior, a former park ranger whose weathered face suggested he'd seen enough to develop a healthy skepticism about the natural world. "Equipment starts acting up when we get close to an incident site." Our team consisted of 4 operatives: Curtis, myself, Agent Olivia Chen, a forensic specialist who transferred from the FBI after what she described as irreconcilable differences with reality, and Agent Harold Stern, whose background in anthropology had led him to specialize in what the Bureau euphemistically called cultural anomalies. We were investigating the disappearance of the Morrison family, who had vanished from their campsite near Lake Superior 3 days earlier. Bob Morrison, his wife Sarah, and their 12-year-old daughter Emma had been experienced campers, equipped with proper gear and familiar with the area. Yet sometime between their last radio check-in and dawn, they had simply ceased to exist. "Local search and rescue found the campsite intact," Harold said, consulting his notes. "Tents still zipped, food untouched, vehicles locked and keys inside. No signs of struggle, no footprints leading away from the site. But here's what's interesting. The family's dog was found 2 miles away, cowering under a fallen log. Animal was traumatized, wouldn't let anyone approach for hours." I studied the dense forest around us, noting how the afternoon shadows seemed to pool in unnatural configurations. During training, they'd taught us to recognize the signs that preceded anomalous events: electronic equipment malfunctions, unusual animal behavior, and what the manual described as atmospheric disturbances that manifested as a sense of wrongness that couldn't be quantified but was unmistakable once experienced. "Temperatures dropping," Olivia observed, checking her instruments. "Down 6 degrees in the past 20 minutes. No meteorological explanation." We moved through the forest in practiced formation, maintaining visual contact while scanning for anything that didn't belong. The Bureau's training had emphasized the importance of trusting instincts over logic in these situations, a lesson that ran counter to everything I'd learned in the military but proved essential when dealing with phenomena that existed outside normal parameters. The Morrison campsite lay in a small clearing beside a stream that chattered over smooth stones. At first glance, everything appeared exactly as the local authorities had described. 2 tents properly staked, a cold fire pit surrounded by camping chairs, Coleman lanterns hanging from tree branches. But as we approached, the wrongness became palpable. "Jesus," Curtis whispered. "You feel that?" The air itself seemed thick, pressing against us with an almost physical weight. Our radio equipment began crackling with static, and the GPS devices showed our location shifting randomly despite our stationary position. But it was the silence that truly unsettled me. No bird calls, no insect sounds, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The forest had gone dead around us. Olivia began photographing the scene while Harold took environmental readings. I noticed that the family's footprints were clearly visible in the soft earth around the campsite, but they stopped abruptly at the tree line, as though the Morrisons had simply stepped into the forest and ceased to exist. "Look at this," Harold called from beside a massive oak tree at the clearing's edge. Carved into the bark was a symbol I didn't recognize, a series of intersecting lines that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. This wasn't made with a knife. The cuts are too smooth, too deep, and they're fresh, maybe 24 hours old. I approached the symbol, noting how it seemed to draw the eye while simultaneously creating a sense of revulsion. During our folklore briefings, they'd shown us similar markings found at other disappearance sites. Symbols that appeared across different geographical regions with no apparent cultural connection. "Movement," Curtis said sharply, raising his hand for silence. We froze, scanning the forest for any sign of life. Then I heard it, a sound like wind through branches, except there was no wind. The noise came from deeper in the woods, rhythmic and purposeful, like breathing on a massive scale. "That's not natural," Olivia whispered, her camera forgotten. The sound grew closer, accompanied by a sensation I could only describe as presence, the feeling of being watched by something vast and patient. Our equipment began malfunctioning more severely, radios emitting bursts of what sounded like voices speaking in languages that predated recorded history. "We need to move," Curtis said. But as he spoke, the forest around us began to change. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches intertwining overhead to block out the sky. The clearing's dimensions shifted subtly, distances becoming uncertain, familiar landmarks disappearing when we looked away and back again. Most disturbing of all, new sounds emerged from the woods. The laughter of children, a woman calling someone's name, footsteps that circled our position without ever revealing their source. "Morrison family," Harold breathed. "They're still here." But even as he said it, we all understood that whatever remained of the Morrison family was no longer entirely human. The voices carried an echo, a harmonic resonance that suggested they came from somewhere else entirely, filtered through a medium that distorted them into approximations of their former selves. I felt my training kick in, the rational military mind asserting control over the primitive fear that threatened to overwhelm me. "We stick together, document everything, and follow extraction protocols if the situation deteriorates further." The voices grew closer, calling to us now with increasing urgency. "Help us," came Sarah Morrison's voice from the darkness between the trees. "We're lost. We can't find our way back." Emma's voice joined her mother's. "Please, we've been walking so long, the paths keep changing." And then Bob Morrison. "There's something wrong with this place. The trees, they move when you're not looking." Curtis raised his radio, attempting to contact our base station, but the device only produced static punctuated by fragments of transmission. Our own voices, recorded from earlier in the day, played back at irregular intervals and wrong speeds. "The symbol," Harold said suddenly. "It's a marker. These places are thresholds, boundaries between what we understand and what exists beyond understanding." The breathing sound intensified, now clearly coming from multiple directions simultaneously. And in the growing darkness between the trees, shapes began to move. Tall, elongated figures that seemed to be composed of shadow and suggestion rather than solid matter. "They're not the Morrison family," Olivia said, her voice steady despite the impossible situation unfolding around us. Something's using their voices. The realization hit me with the force of revelation. We weren't conducting a rescue operation. We were witnessing a harvest. As the shadows pressed closer and the borrowed voices of the missing family called to us with increasing desperation, I understood that the Morrison family had found something in these woods that had been waiting for them. Something old and patient and hungry for human contact, and now it was calling to us. We extracted from the Michigan site at dawn, leaving behind equipment that had been fundamentally altered by our overnight exposure to whatever dwelt in those woods. My radio now picked up transmissions that contained voices speaking in languages that shouldn't exist. And Olivia's camera had captured images that showed landscape features not visible to the naked eye. Structures that appeared to be constructed from living wood and shadow. The drive back to headquarters in Virginia felt like surfacing from deep water, the normal world gradually reasserting itself as we put distance between ourselves and the threshold we'd discovered. But the experience had marked us all. Curtis barely spoke during the 8-hour journey, while Harold filled 3 notebooks with observations that would eventually form the basis for updated field protocols. The voices were perfect, Olivia said as we crossed into West Virginia. Exact vocal patterns, speech mannerisms, emotional inflections. Whatever we encountered had absorbed every detail of the Morrison family's vocal signatures. I stared out at the passing landscape, normal countryside that now seemed fragile and temporary after what we'd witnessed. How many other sites are active? Harold consulted his files. Currently, 17 confirmed locations across the continental United States. Michigan was showing increased activity for the past month, which is why we were deployed there. But the pattern suggests these sites activate and go dormant cyclically. Agent Blackwood debriefed us personally upon our return. Sitting in the same sterile conference room where I'd first learned about the Bureau's true mission, he listened to our reports with the detached attention of someone who had heard similar accounts many times before, occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. The voice mimicry represents an evolution in their hunting patterns, he said after reviewing Olivia's photographic evidence. Early reports from the 1940s describe these entities as primarily relying on visual lures, family members appearing at the edge of clearings calling for help. The vocal component has become more sophisticated over the decades. What are they? I asked. I mean, what are we actually dealing with out there? Blackwood's expression suggested this was a question he'd been asked many times without ever developing a satisfactory answer. The indigenous populations of North America had names for them, but the concepts don't translate well into English. The closest approximation would be hunger that wears faces. They appear to be entities that exist in the spaces between human understanding and natural law. He activated a wall-mounted display showing a map of the United States dotted with red markers. Each marker represents a confirmed threshold site. Notice the distribution pattern. They're not random. These locations correspond to places where the landscape itself has been altered by traumatic events. Battlefields, sites of natural disasters, areas where large numbers of people died under violent circumstances. The pattern was unmistakable once he pointed it out. Many of the markers clustered around Civil War battle sites, areas affected by industrial disasters, and regions where entire populations had vanished during the early colonial period. Whatever these entities were, they seemed drawn to locations where human suffering had somehow scarred the landscape itself. Our mission parameters are changing, Blackwood continued. We're no longer simply responding to disappearances. We're implementing containment protocols at active sites and developing early warning systems for areas showing signs of threshold formation. The next 3 months took our team across the country, investigating incidents in Oregon's Cascade Wilderness, Pennsylvania's Allegheny National Forest, and Wisconsin's remote Northwoods. Each site presented variations on the same theme: families, hikers, or hunters who vanished without trace, leaving behind evidence of encounters with entities that seemed to exist in the margins between reality and nightmare. In Oregon, we found a campsite where the missing family's tent had been reconstructed from pine boughs woven together with impossible precision, as though the forest itself had attempted to recreate human shelter. The surrounding trees bore the same symbolic markings we'd seen in Michigan, but here they appeared to be carved from the inside out, the bark pushed outward by some internal pressure. Pennsylvania presented a more disturbing scenario. The missing hunting party had left behind their weapons, arranged in a perfect circle around a fire that had burned for days without consuming any actual fuel. Local authorities found no footprints leading away from the site, but our instruments detected electromagnetic anomalies suggesting the presence of something massive moving through the surrounding forest. "They're getting bolder," Curtis observed as we documented the Pennsylvania site. Earlier reports describe entities that remained hidden, operating through misdirection and illusion. These recent incidents show direct manipulation of physical matter. Wisconsin nearly cost us a team member. Agent Chen disappeared for 6 hours while we investigated a site where 3 hikers had vanished during a blizzard the previous winter. We found her sitting motionless beside a frozen stream, staring at something none of us could see. When we finally managed to get her attention, she described watching the missing hikers playing in the snow, calling to her to join their game. "They seemed so happy," she told us later, after the medical team had cleared her for duty. "Like they'd found something wonderful in the woods and wanted to share it. I wanted to go with them." The psychological evaluations that followed revealed a disturbing trend. Extended exposure to threshold sites was causing gradual changes in our brain chemistry, alterations that made us more susceptible to the entity's influence. The Bureau implemented new rotation schedules and mandatory counseling sessions, but the knowledge that we were being slowly changed by our work cast a shadow over every subsequent mission. Dr. Emily Rodriguez, the Bureau's staff psychologist, explained the situation during a team meeting in December. "What you're experiencing isn't traditional psychological trauma. The entities appear to operate by gradually altering human perception, making their victims more receptive to alternate forms of reality. The longer you're exposed, the more natural their influence seems." I thought about the Morrison family, calling to us from the darkness between the trees, their voices perfect in every detail except for the harmonic resonance that suggested they were no longer entirely themselves. How long had they wandered in that space between worlds before they stopped remembering who they had been? "The good news," Dr. Rodriguez continued, "is that we're developing countermeasures. Certain electromagnetic frequencies seem to disrupt their influence, and we're working on equipment that will provide some protection during field operations." But I could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the same doubt that had crept into all of us as we learned more about what we were fighting. The entities weren't just hunting isolated victims in remote wilderness areas. They were slowly expanding their influence, creating new threshold sites, and developing more sophisticated methods of attracting prey. That night I called my mother from my apartment in Arlington, needing to hear a familiar voice after weeks of listening to perfect vocal mimicry that served purposes I was only beginning to understand. "You sound tired, honey," she said, and I could hear the improvement in her voice that the Bureau's medical coverage had made possible. "Are you taking care of yourself?" "Just work stress," I told her, staring out at the city lights that seemed reassuringly normal after the alien darkness of threshold sites. "How are you feeling?" "Good days and bad days, but more good ones lately. The new treatment is expensive but worth it. I'm grateful you found work that provides such good insurance." I closed my eyes, thinking about the price of that insurance. Somewhere in the American wilderness, entities that existed beyond human understanding were collecting victims, wearing their voices like masks, and slowly expanding their hunting grounds. And I was part of a secret war against forces that most people couldn't even conceptualize. "Mom," I said, "I want you to promise me something. Don't go camping or hiking alone. Don't go into any wilderness areas without telling someone exactly where you're going." "Riley, what's this about?" "Just promise me," she agreed, probably attributing my paranoia to military training and work stress. But as I hung up the phone, I stared at the map on my wall, marked with locations where families had vanished and entities waited in the spaces between the trees. The red pins were multiplying, and winter was coming to the American wilderness. The call came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in February, jolting me from dreams filled with voices that spoke in harmonics no human throat could produce. Agent Blackwood's voice carried an urgency I'd never heard before as he briefed me on our emergency deployment to North Carolina's Appalachian wilderness. "Situations escalated," he said without preamble. "Entire research team from Duke University has vanished in the Pisgah National Forest. 12 people, including graduate students and faculty members. They were investigating historical disappearances in the region, essentially doing our job without our knowledge or preparation." I was already dressing, muscle memory from military service taking over while my mind processed the implications. "How long since last contact?" 48 hours. Their last transmission mentioned discovering significant archaeological evidence near Lookingglass Rock. Local authorities found their base camp abandoned, but there's something else. The area is showing threshold activity unlike anything we've encountered before. The flight to North Carolina was a blur of briefings and equipment checks. Our expanded team included specialists from multiple disciplines. Dr. Margaret Hazel, a cultural anthropologist who had been studying indigenous folklore related to threshold sites, Agent Jean Fletcher, whose background in military communications had proven essential for maintaining contact in areas where normal technology failed, and Dr. Aurora Mitchell, a physicist whose research into electromagnetic anomalies had become crucial to understanding how the entities manipulated their environment. The Cherokee called this region Kitowa, Dr. Hazel explained as our helicopter approached the landing zone. It translates roughly as place where the spirits gather. According to oral tradition, the area was avoided by hunting parties because travelers would encounter relatives who had died years earlier, beckoning them into the deep forest. Agent Fletcher monitored our communications equipment, watching frequencies shift and degrade as we approached the target area. I'm detecting transmission echoes that predate our arrival by several days. The entities are broadcasting the Duke team's voices in a pattern that suggests they're trying to attract additional victims. The landing zone was a cleared area 2 miles from the missing team's last known position. As our boots touched the ground, I felt the familiar pressure that accompanied active threshold sites, but this was different, stronger, more focused, as though something vast was concentrating its attention on our arrival. Dr. Mitchell's instruments immediately began detecting anomalies. Electromagnetic readings are off the charts. Whatever's happening here is significantly more powerful than previous sites. The entire area is saturated with energy signatures that don't match any known natural phenomena. We moved through the forest in careful formation, following GPS coordinates that seemed to shift when we weren't directly monitoring them. The February air was bitter cold, but our breath didn't fog the way it should have, and snow that had fallen the previous night showed footprint patterns that led in impossible directions, upward along tree trunks, across gaps between branches, and into solid stone formations. Multiple voice contacts, Agent Fletcher reported through our modified radio system. I'm picking up at least 8 distinct individuals calling for help from various directions. The transmissions are too clear, too perfectly spaced. It's like they're being staged. The Duke team's base camp lay in a hollow surrounded by ancient hemlocks, their massive trunks creating natural windbreaks that should have provided shelter from the mountain weather. Instead, the area felt exposed, vulnerable, as though the trees themselves were watching us with patient malevolence. Their equipment remained meticulously organized. Computers still powered on, displaying research notes about historical disappearances dating back to the Cherokee removal. Dr. Sarah Morrison, no relation to the Michigan family, had been documenting patterns in the colonial-era records, identifying locations where entire settlements had vanished without explanation. "Look at this," Dr. Hazel said, studying Morrison's computer screen. She was mapping correlations between disappearance sites and geological features. The threshold locations all correspond to areas where underground waterways create natural acoustic chambers. The revelation struck me like a physical blow. The entities weren't randomly selecting hunting grounds. They were drawn to places where the landscape itself could amplify and distort sound, creating perfect conditions for their vocal mimicry. Agent Fletcher's radio crackled with a familiar voice. "Dr. Hazel, is that you? Thank God, we've been trapped in a cave system for 2 days. We can see your lights. Follow the sound of my voice." The transmission was perfect. Dr. Morrison's voice, exact in every detail down to her slight Boston accent and tendency to speak quickly when excited. But Dr. Morrison had never met Dr. Hazel, and according to the research notes, the Duke team had been investigating surface-level archaeological sites, not cave systems. "Don't respond," I warned. "It's learning our voices, our names, our relationships." But even as I spoke, the forest around us began to change. Paths appeared between the trees where none had existed moments before, marked with stones arranged in patterns that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. The temperature fluctuated wildly, dropping 20 degrees in seconds before warming to an unseasonable mildness that felt wrong against February's bitter landscape. Dr. Mitchell's instruments detected massive energy surges preceding each environmental change. It's manipulating local weather patterns, geological features, even the behavior of plant matter. The entire area is becoming something else. The voices of the Duke team grew more insistent, calling to us from multiple directions with stories of injury, equipment failure, and desperate need for rescue. But underneath their familiar cadences, I began to detect something else, a harmonic resonance that suggested the voices were being filtered through something vast and alien before reaching our ears. The cave system is real, Dr. Hazel said, consulting topographical maps. There's an extensive network beneath this area, formed by underground rivers over millions of years. If the entities are using the acoustic properties, she didn't need to finish. If the creatures had access to natural amplification systems that could project voices across miles of forest, their hunting range was far larger than we'd understood. They could be calling to potential victims from dozens of miles away, using the mountain itself as a massive resonating chamber. Night fell with unnatural speed, darkness flowing between the trees like liquid shadow. Our lighting equipment cast insufficient pools of illumination that seemed to be absorbed rather than reflected by the surrounding forest. And in that darkness, shapes began to move, tall, elongated figures that might have been trees swaying in non-existent wind or something else entirely. Contact, Agent Fletcher reported. Human figures approaching from the northeast, approximately 50 meters. Through our night vision equipment, we could see them clearly, the Duke research team, walking single file through the forest with the measured pace of people following a familiar trail. They appeared unharmed, properly clothed for the conditions, moving with purpose toward our position. Dr. Morrison? Dr. Hazel called out. Dr. Chen, are you all right? The lead figure raised her hand in greeting, and even at distance, I could see Dr. Morrison's face clearly. She appeared exactly as she did in the photographs from Duke University's faculty directory, down to the wire-rimmed glasses and practical outdoor clothing. But something was wrong with the way she moved. Her gait was too regular, too measured, like someone learning to walk by following precise instructions. And when she spoke, her voice carried perfectly across the distance without any of the distortion that should have resulted from speaking through cold mountain air. We found something incredible, she called. Archaeological evidence of pre-Columbian settlement, unlike anything in the academic literature. You need to see this. The other team members echoed her enthusiasm, their voices blending into a chorus of academic excitement that would have been completely convincing under normal circumstances. But I noticed that they all spoke with the same rhythm, the same vocal patterns, as though they were being operated by a single intelligence that was still learning to differentiate between its various masks. That's not them, I said quietly into my radio. Whatever those things are, they're not human. As if responding to my words, the figures stopped moving. For a long moment, they stood motionless in the forest, and I had the unsettling impression that they were listening to something we couldn't hear. Then Dr. Morrison tilted her head at an angle that would have broken a human neck, and smiled with far too many teeth. The hunt had begun. What followed was the longest night of my life, spent playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek with entities that wore the faces of the missing Duke team while hunting us through a forest that had become something other than natural landscape. The creatures, for lack of a better term, pursued us with relentless patience, calling out in perfect voices that carried promises of safety, warmth, and academic discovery. They moved through the darkness with impossible silence, appearing at the edge of our vision before vanishing when we turned our lights toward them. They're hurting us, Agent Fletcher observed as we took shelter in a rocky outcropping that provided some protection from multiple directions. Every time we try to move toward the extraction point, they appear in that direction, forcing us deeper into the forest. Dr. Mitchell's instruments showed electromagnetic readings that defied comprehension. The entire area is becoming saturated with their influence. Whatever these entities are, they're not just inhabiting this space, they're transforming it into something more suitable for their purposes. I thought about the missing families, the hikers and hunters who had vanished into spaces like this one. How long had they wandered through transformed landscapes before they stopped remembering who they had been? How many were still out there, calling to new victims with voices that had once belonged to ordinary people? The Duke team, Dr. Hazel said suddenly. They might still be alive. If the entities need time to process their victims, there might be a window for rescue. It was a desperate hope, but it gave us direction. Instead of simply trying to escape, we began moving deeper into the forest. following the electromagnetic readings toward what Dr. Mitchell believed was the source of the anomalous activity. The landscape became increasingly surreal as we advanced. Trees grew in impossible configurations, their branches weaving together to form structures that resembled buildings more than natural formations. The ground beneath our feet felt unstable, as though we were walking on a surface that existed only as long as we believed in it. There, Dr. Mitchell pointed toward a depression in the landscape where her instruments detected massive energy concentrations. Something's down there, something big. The depression led to a cave entrance that definitely hadn't existed on any geological survey. The opening was perfectly circular, lined with stones that had been fitted together with architectural precision, but the stones themselves were wrong. Too smooth, too uniform, as though they had been grown rather than carved. Cherokee folklore describes places like this, Dr. Hazel whispered. Doorways to the nightland, where spirits gather the lost and forgotten. Our modified radio equipment detected voices coming from within the cave, the Duke team, calling for help with increasing desperation. But intertwined with their pleas were other voices, dozens of them, representing people who had vanished from these mountains over decades or centuries. We have to go in, I said, checking my equipment one final time. If there's any chance they're still alive. The cave system extended far deeper than our lighting could penetrate. A network of chambers and passages that seemed to pulse with its own organic rhythm. The walls were lined with the same symbols we'd found at other sites. But here they appeared to be carved into living rock that responded to our presence by glowing with soft, phosphorescent light. In the deepest chamber we found them. The Duke research team sat in a perfect circle, their eyes closed, their lips moving in silent conversation with something we couldn't see. They appeared unharmed, but there was something wrong with their posture, their breathing, the way their heads tilted at identical angles as though they were listening to the same distant voice. Dr. Morrison? Dr. Hazel approached cautiously. Can you hear me? Morrison's eyes opened, but they reflected light like an animal's, and when she smiled it was with genuine warmth that somehow felt more terrifying than any display of hostility. Dr. Hazel, she said in a voice that was perfectly, horrifyingly normal. We've been waiting for you. We've learned so much. The entities, they're not malevolent. They're trying to preserve us, to keep us safe from a world that's destroying itself. The other team members opened their eyes in perfect synchronization, all wearing the same expression of serene contentment. They began to speak in overlapping voices, describing revelations about the nature of reality, about how the entities were offering humanity a chance to transcend the limitations of physical existence. They show us the truth, Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in the cave walls themselves. The forests, the wilderness, they're not empty spaces, they're libraries, preserving the memories of everyone who has ever walked beneath the trees. I felt the seductive pull of their words, the promise of joining something larger than individual existence. The entities weren't simply harvesting victims. They were offering a form of immortality, a way to become part of the landscape itself, to exist forever in the spaces between human understanding and natural law. But as I looked at the Duke team's faces, I saw what that immortality cost. They were still themselves, but they were also something else. Something that existed partially in our reality and partially in the alien space that the entities called home. We can't stay, I said, forcing myself to step backward. We have to leave. Now. Dr. Morrison's expression never changed, but the temperature in the cave dropped 20 degrees in an instant. You don't understand yet, but you will. Everyone who comes here eventually understands. The cave walls began to pulse more rapidly, and I realized that we weren't in a natural formation at all. We were inside something living, something vast and patient that had been waiting beneath the mountains for centuries, collecting voices and memories and human experiences like a scholar gathering books. Move, I shouted, grabbing Dr. Hazel's arm and pulling her toward the entrance. Behind us, the Duke team began to sing in harmonics that no human throat could produce, their voices blending with others that seemed to come from the rock itself. The sound was beautiful and terrible, a lullaby that promised peace and safety and an end to all the fears that drove human existence. We ran through passages that stretched and contracted around us, up toward a circle of stars that seemed impossibly distant. The singing followed us, growing stronger with each step, promising that we could return whenever we chose. that the entities would wait with infinite patience for us to understand what they were offering. The extraction helicopter found us at dawn, 3 miles from where we'd entered the forest, suffering from hypothermia and exhibiting signs of mild electromagnetic exposure. We were debriefed extensively, our equipment analyzed, our accounts verified against instrument readings that defied conventional physics. The Duke research team was declared missing, presumed dead. Their disappearance attributed to a combination of severe weather and equipment failure. The area around Looking Glass Rock was quietly designated as a restricted zone, closed to civilian access indefinitely, but I know they're still down there, waiting in chambers beneath the mountains, adding their voices to a choir that has been growing for centuries. And sometimes late at night I find myself listening for their song, remembering the promise of peace they offered, the chance to become part of something larger than the desperate struggle of individual existence. The Bureau transferred me to desk duty after North Carolina, citing psychological concerns that weren't entirely wrong. I work with satellite imagery now, identifying potential threshold sites before they become active, maintaining the maps that mark places where reality grows thin. My mother's cancer went into remission, the experimental treatments made possible by my federal health coverage proving successful beyond our best hopes. She's planning a camping trip to celebrate, somewhere in the quiet forests of her youth. And I've run out of excuses to discourage her without revealing why certain wilderness areas should never be visited alone. Tonight I'm sitting in my Arlington apartment, staring at a map marked with red pins that seem to multiply each time I look away. Somewhere in the American wilderness, entities that exist beyond human understanding are calling to the lost and lonely, offering them a place in an endless song that preserves human experience long after human bodies have returned to dust. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I wonder if they might be offering something better than the world we've built from concrete and steel and digital connections that never quite touch the profound loneliness of modern existence. The choice is always there, waiting in the spaces between the trees. All I have to do is listen. My name is Marcus Webb, and I should have known better than to trust a government contract that paid too well for too little information. But when you're staring at eviction notices in your cramped Detroit apartment, watching your neighbors get foreclosed on one by one, and your favorite late-night diner just closed because nobody could afford to eat there anymore, you don't ask too many questions about a job that promises to triple your military pension. I'd been living in the Corktown district for 3 years since my discharge from the Army Rangers, surviving on disability payments that barely covered my rent in what used to be Detroit's most affordable neighborhood. My favorite things in life had become simple necessities: black coffee from the corner bodega, old paperback thrillers from the used bookstore on Michigan Avenue, and the occasional Tigers game on the radio while I sat on my fire escape, watching the city slowly rebuild itself around me. The recruiter found me at Murphy's Tavern on a Tuesday night in March. I was nursing my second beer, making it last because it was all I could afford until my next check cleared. Harold Briggs looked like every other government spook I'd ever met. Forgettable face, gray suit, eyes that had seen too much. He slid into the booth across from me without invitation. Marcus Webb, Staff Sergeant, 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. Served 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. Decorated for valor at Firebase Echo. He placed a thick manila envelope on the scarred wooden table between us. "You're exactly what we're looking for." "And what exactly are you looking for?" I asked, not touching the envelope. "Someone who understands that the world has dark places that don't appear on any map. Someone who can follow orders without asking questions that don't have comfortable answers." Harold leaned back, studying my face. "Someone who needs the money." The bastard had done his homework. My credit score was in the toilet, my savings account had been empty for months, and my student loans from the criminal justice degree I'd never finished were in default. I was 3 weeks behind on rent, and my landlord, Mrs. Chen, had been patient enough, but patience doesn't pay property taxes. "What's the job?" I asked. "Missing persons recovery, specialized cases, remote locations, situations where conventional law enforcement isn't equipped to handle the circumstances." Harold tapped the envelope with one finger. "The pay is $150,000 annually, plus hazard compensation and full benefits. Housing provided." I nearly choked on my beer. "What's the catch?" 5-year commitment. Absolute discretion required. You'll be working with a small team across multiple states: Michigan, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, North Carolina. The work can be dangerous and sometimes unusual. The envelope felt heavy when I finally picked it up. Inside were contracts, NDAs thick enough to stop a bullet, and photographs that made my blood run cold. Crime scenes that looked like something out of a nightmare. Missing person reports with details that didn't make sense. Search areas marked in forests that seemed to stretch beyond the edges of the satellite images. What happened to these people? I asked, holding up a photo of a campsite that looked like it had been torn apart by something with claws the size of dinner plates. That's what you'll be finding out, Harold said. But I'll be honest with you, Webb. Most of the time, we're not bringing people home. We're bringing closure. And sometimes we're just making sure whatever took them doesn't take anyone else. I thought about Mrs. Chen's worried face when I'd asked for another extension. I thought about the stack of overdue bills on my kitchen table, held down by an empty coffee can that used to contain my emergency fund. I thought about my father, who'd worked construction for 30 years until his back gave out, and how he'd raised me to believe that honest work was the only work worth doing, but honest work wasn't paying the bills. And I'd been out of options for longer than I cared to admit. Where do I sign? I asked. Harold smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Training starts Monday. You'll be assigned to Unit 7. We call ourselves the recovery team. Your first assignment is in the Huron-Manistee National Forest. 3 hikers went missing last month. Local authorities called off the search after 2 weeks. Why? Because the search and rescue team started disappearing too. I should have walked away. Should have torn up the contract and gone back to my crumbling apartment to figure out another way to make ends meet. But the weight of financial desperation is heavier than fear, and sometimes survival requires embracing the very thing that might kill you. I signed the papers with a pen that felt heavier than the rifle I'd carried through the mountains of Afghanistan. Harold collected the documents with the efficiency of a man who'd done this many times before. One last thing, he said, standing to leave. Don't try to research us, don't dig into the organization, don't ask questions about the chain of command, and whatever you do, don't tell anyone, not your family, not your friends, not your priest, about the things you're going to see. The NDAs you just signed aren't just legal documents, they're survival instructions. He left me alone in the tavern with an empty beer glass and the growing certainty that I'd just sold my soul to pay my rent. But as I walked back to my apartment through Detroit's cold March night, passing boarded-up houses and streets where half the streetlights had been shot out, I tried to convince myself that some souls weren't worth much to begin with. The next morning, I packed everything I owned into 2 duffel bags and left a note for Mrs. Chen along with enough cash to cover what I owed her. I didn't know when I'd be back to Detroit or if I'd be coming back at all. The government van picked me up at 0600 hours sharp. As we drove north toward the training facility, I watched the city fade in the rear window and tried not to think about the photographs in Harold's envelope. The torn tents, the scattered camping gear, the long scratch marks carved deep into the bark of ancient trees. I'd been trained to hunt men in the desert. Now I was going to learn to hunt something else entirely in the deep woods where civilization ended and the old stories began. The stories that reasonable people didn't believe and unreasonable people didn't survive. The recovery team training facility sat in an unmarked compound 30 miles north of Grand Rapids, surrounded by razor wire and warning signs that threatened federal prosecution for trespassing. They gave me a week to learn everything I thought I knew about missing persons cases was wrong. Our instructor was a woman named Grace Chen. No relation to my former landlord, she assured me with a humor so dry it could start fires. Grace had been with the recovery team for 8 years, though she looked like she'd aged twice that in the job. Her dark hair was streaked with premature gray, and her eyes held the 1,000-yard stare I recognized from my own mirror. Forget everything you learned about tracking in the military, she told our class of 6 new recruits on the first day. In conventional warfare, you're hunting rational actors with predictable patterns. What we hunt doesn't follow human logic. The other recruits were a mix of former military and law enforcement. There was Craig Morrison, ex-FBI, who'd been quietly shuffled out after investigating a case in Oregon that officially never happened. Perry Dalton came from Marine Reconnaissance and had the same haunted look as Grace. Wesley Park had been a detective in Wisconsin until he'd started asking the wrong questions about a series of disappearances near the Checkamauga National Forest. The entities we encounter don't just take people, Grace continued. clicking through a slideshow of crime scenes that would have looked fake if they hadn't been photographed by federal forensics teams. They consume them, body, soul, and memory. Sometimes they leave traces, physical evidence that contradicts everything we know about natural predation. Sometimes they leave nothing at all. She showed us photographs from Pennsylvania, a hunting cabin where a family of 4 had vanished overnight, leaving behind meals half-eaten on the table and a television still playing cartoons. The local police report mentioned unusual atmospheric disturbances and equipment malfunctions that prevented proper investigation. "Your job isn't to understand these entities," Grace said. "Your job is to find what's left of their victims and neutralize the threat before it spreads to populated areas. We're not scientists, we're janitors cleaning up messes that weren't supposed to exist." The training was unlike anything I'd experienced in the Rangers. We learned to identify territorial markings that looked like ancient symbols carved into tree bark. We practiced navigation techniques for areas where compasses spun wildly and GPS signals died without explanation. We studied folklore from Native American tribes, European settlers, and logging camps. Stories that the government had spent decades dismissing as superstition. The indigenous peoples of these regions had protocols for dealing with what they called hunger spirits. Grace explained during a night class that felt more like a supernatural studies course than tactical training. They understood that certain places should be avoided, certain seasons were more dangerous than others, and certain behaviors could attract unwanted attention. She taught us to recognize the signs: trees that grew in impossible spirals, areas where wildlife refused to venture, and the particular quality of silence that fell over a forest when something unnatural claimed territory. We learned to trust our instincts when the hair on our necks stood up, when our dreams turned violent, and when the shadows seemed to move independently of their sources. "The entities we track are territorial," Grace said. "They don't usually venture far from their chosen hunting grounds. But they're also intelligent. They learn, they adapt, and they remember anyone who interferes with their feeding patterns." On my final day of training, Grace pulled me aside after the others had left. "You're being assigned to Sector 7. The Huron-Manistee region in Michigan," she said. "It's considered one of our more active zones. 3 confirmed entity territories, possibly more. Your team leader is Eugene Vasquez. He's been hunting these things for 12 years and he's still alive, which makes him either very good or very lucky." She handed me a file folder marked with classifications I'd never seen before. "Your first case is already 3 weeks old. 3 experienced hikers, all former military, all well-equipped, entered the forest near Baldwin on a 4-day camping trip. They never came out." "Local search and rescue?" I asked. "Lost 2 teams before they called us in. Both times the search teams reported equipment failures, disorientation, and what they described as aggressive wildlife behavior. The last team to go in lost contact with base camp on their 2nd night. We found their gear scattered across 2 miles of forest, but no bodies." Grace's expression darkened. "Whatever's hunting in that section of the Manistee has developed a taste for people who know how to survive in the wilderness. It's not taking random hikers anymore. It's targeting experienced outdoorsmen who should be able to defend themselves." I studied the topographical maps in the file, noting the areas marked with red X's, previous disappearance sites dating back 6 months. They formed a rough circle around a section of old-growth forest that appeared as a blank space on most commercial maps. "What am I walking into?" I asked. "Something that's been hungry for a very long time," Grace said, "and something that's gotten very good at hunting hunters." The next morning, I drove my assigned vehicle, a modified SUV equipped with communication gear that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie, toward the Manistee National Forest. The autumn colors were beginning to turn, painting the landscape in shades of red and gold that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. I met Eugene at the ranger station in Baldwin, a small town that existed primarily to service hunters and hikers heading into the forest. Eugene looked exactly like what central casting would order for a grizzled outdoorsman. 45 years old, weathered face, gray beard, and eyes that had seen too much. He was checking equipment when I arrived. Specialized gear that included electromagnetic field detectors, night vision equipment rated for conditions darker than normal nightfall, and weapons that weren't standard issue for any military I'd served with. "You must be Webb," he said without looking up from the modified rifle he was cleaning. "Grace says you were Rangers. That's good. Rangers know how to follow orders without asking stupid questions. What am I not supposed to ask about? I said. Eugene finally looked at me, and I saw something in his expression that made my survival instincts twitch. Everything, he said. The less you know going in, the better your chances of coming out with your sanity intact. He handed me a detailed map of our search area, marked with notations in red ink that looked like warning signs in a language I didn't recognize. We go in tomorrow at first light, Eugene said. 3 days maximum. We find what's left of those hikers, we document everything, and we get out before whatever took them decides it wants seconds. I spent that night in a motel room in Baldwin, staring at the forest maps and trying to understand what I'd gotten myself into. Outside my window, the Manistee Forest stretched toward the horizon like a dark ocean, and somewhere in its depths something was waiting that had learned to hunt the hunters. We entered the Huron-Manistee National Forest at 0630 hours on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the autumn mist still clung to the ground like smoke from a dying fire. Eugene had assembled a team of 4, himself, me, and 2 other recovery team specialists, Sofia Martinez, a former Army medic who joined the unit after treating survivors from what the official reports called unusual wildlife attacks, and Barry Kowalski, an ex-Marine sniper whose file contained more black ink than readable text. The Forest Service had closed the entire sector to civilian access, using the cover story of a controlled burn scheduled for the following month. No hikers, no hunters, no witnesses to whatever we might find in the deep woods where the old maps stopped being accurate. Standard search protocol for unknown entities, Eugene briefed us as we shouldered our packs. Maintain visual contact at all times. No one goes more than 50 meters from the group. If you see something that doesn't belong, and I mean anything, you call it out immediately. Don't try to rationalize it. Don't assume it's harmless. These things count on your disbelief. We followed a trail that led northwest from the parking area, deeper into sections of forest that predated European settlement. The trees grew larger as we progressed, some old enough to have been saplings when the first French explorers paddled up the Manistee River. The canopy above us filtered the morning light into a green twilight that felt perpetually on the edge of evening. Barry led point, his sniper's eyes scanning for signs of disturbance. Sophia followed, carrying medical equipment and sensors that monitored atmospheric conditions, temperature variations, electromagnetic fluctuations, and other environmental changes that might indicate unnatural presence. I took the rear position, keeping watch for anything that might be following us. The forest felt wrong from the beginning. Not obviously dangerous, but subtly off balance, like a song played in a minor key when you expected major. The bird calls were muted, as if the wildlife was deliberately keeping quiet. The underbrush rustled without wind, and there was a smell in the air, something organic and cloying that reminded me of meat left too long in summer heat. First disappearance site is 2 clicks ahead, Eugene said, consulting a GPS unit that flickered intermittently despite clear skies. 3 college kids from Michigan State disappeared last April during spring break camping trip. We found the site marked by orange surveyor's tape tied to trees in a rough perimeter. The clearing showed signs of hasty investigation, areas where the ground had been excavated, flagged locations where evidence had been collected, and yellow crime scene tape that had faded to the color of old bones. What did the initial investigation find? I asked. Campsite looked normal until the 3rd day, Eugene said, referring to notes in a waterproof folder. Tents intact, food supplies untouched, gear organized exactly as it should be. But no signs of the campers. It was like they just walked away from their lives and disappeared into the forest. Sophia knelt beside what had been the fire pit, running her hands through dirt that looked darker than it should. Soil composition is off, she said. Higher iron content than normal, and there's something else. Organic compounds that don't match the local ecosystem. Barry had found something at the edge of the clearing. Over here, he called quietly. You need to see this. We gathered around a cluster of pine trees where the bark showed deep scratches running from ground level to about 8 feet high. The marks were too regular to be from bears, too deep to be from any animal that should exist in Michigan's forests. These were made after the disappearance, Eugene said, studying the gouges in the wood. The initial investigation team documented the site thoroughly. These marks weren't here in April, so whatever took them came back, I said. They always come back, Eugene replied. The entities we track are territorial. They mark their feeding grounds and return to them regularly. That's how we know where to find them. We continued deeper into the forest, following a trail that grew increasingly difficult to track. The GPS began malfunctioning more frequently, showing our position jumping randomly across the screen. Compass readings swung wildly. Even the sun seemed harder to locate through the canopy above. The second disappearance site was 3 miles northwest, in a valley where a stream should have been flowing but wasn't. The dry creek bed wound between moss-covered boulders, disappearing into a grove of trees that looked like they'd been twisted by some immense force. Family of 4, Eugene said. Parents and 2 teenage kids. Experienced campers, well-equipped, reported missing when they failed to check out of their campground reservation. This site showed more obvious signs of violence. Torn fabric hung from branches. Scattered camping equipment lay half-buried under fallen leaves. A backpack had been shredded so thoroughly it looked like it had been put through an industrial shredder. Sophia's atmospheric readings spiked as we explored the area. Temperatures dropping fast, she reported. Down 15 degrees in the last 5 minutes. And I'm getting electromagnetic fluctuations that don't match any natural phenomena. The hair on my neck stood up, a sensation I'd learned to trust during night patrols in Afghanistan. Something was watching us. I could feel the weight of observation, predatory and patient. We need to move, I said quietly. Eugene checked his watch. Agreed. Third site is another 2 miles. We'll investigate and then find a defensible position for the night. The third disappearance site was the most recent, 3 experienced hikers who'd vanished just 4 weeks ago. This was where the evidence became impossible to rationalize. We found their campsite in a small meadow surrounded by ancient oaks. The tents were still standing, but they'd been arranged in a perfect circle around a fire pit that contained no ash, no charcoal, no evidence that any fire had ever burned there. Their gear was organized with military precision, sleeping bags folded, backpacks arranged by size, cooking equipment sorted by function. This is wrong, Barry said, his sniper's instincts recognizing a scene that violated natural order. Nobody organizes their gear like this while camping. This looks like a display. Sophia's readings went haywire. Her electromagnetic detector squealed until she turned it off. The temperature plummeted another 20 degrees in the space of minutes. And then we heard the sound that would haunt my dreams for years afterward. It started as a low humming, like the sound of power lines in the distance, but it grew deeper, more resonant, until I could feel it in my bones. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the trees and reverberating through the ground beneath our feet. What the hell is that? I whispered. Eugene's face had gone pale. That's the sound hungry things make when they're calling for dinner, he said. And we just became the main course. The humming stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like the forest was holding its breath. In that silence we heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and coming from multiple directions at once. Fall back to the tree line, Eugene ordered. Defensive positions, whatever's out there, it's been watching us since we arrived. As we retreated toward the edge of the meadow, I caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows between the oaks. Something large and wrong, moving with intelligence but not humanity. Something that had learned to hunt in patterns that predated civilization, and had recently developed a taste for those who came looking for the missing. The hunt was about to begin in earnest, and we were no longer the hunters. We established our defensive position in a cluster of oak trees at the eastern edge of the meadow, where the undergrowth was thick enough to provide cover but sparse enough to give us clear sight lines. Eugene distributed ammunition that looked nothing like standard military issue. Bullets with cores that glowed faintly in the dim light. Cartridges marked with symbols I didn't recognize. Iron cores blessed by 7 different religious traditions, he explained, checking his modified rifle. The entities we hunt are old, older than any human religion, but they share certain vulnerabilities with the things our ancestors feared. Sophia set up a perimeter of electromagnetic sensors while Barry positioned himself with his sniper rifle trained on the meadow's far side. I took point watch, my own weapon loaded with Eugene's specialized ammunition and my finger hovering near the trigger. The forest had gone completely silent. No bird calls, no insect sounds, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind had stopped, leaving the air still and heavy with the smell of decay that seemed to grow stronger as darkness approached. How many of these things are we dealing with? I asked. In this territory, probably just one, Eugene said. But one is more than enough. The entities that hunt in the Manistee have been feeding here for decades. They're intelligent, territorial, and they've learned human patterns. They know when search teams come looking, and they've developed strategies for dealing with us. What happened to the other recovery teams that went missing? Eugene's expression darkened. The first team underestimated what they were tracking. Thought they were dealing with an unusually aggressive bear or a pack of wolves that had developed aberrant behavior. They went in with standard wildlife protocols and were overrun on their second night. And the second team knew what they were hunting. They just didn't know how smart it had become. As the sun set behind the canopy, the forest transformed into something from a nightmare. Shadows moved independently of their sources. Trees seemed to shift position when observed peripherally, and from somewhere in the darkness surrounding our position, we began to hear sounds that violated every law of nature I thought I understood. First came the voices. Human voices calling for help from different directions. A woman screaming for her children. A man begging someone to stop. A child crying for her mother. The voices were perfect, convincing, designed to trigger our protective instincts and draw us away from our defensive position. Don't listen, Eugene warned. Those aren't people. The entity mimics the voices of previous victims. It's learned that humans respond to distress calls, so it uses our compassion against us. The voices grew more desperate, more convincing. I heard a woman who sounded exactly like my sister calling my name from the darkness beyond the meadow. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to investigate, to help, to abandon our position and run toward the sound. It's not real, Sophia said, but her voice shook with the effort of resisting the calls. The electromagnetic readings are spiking every time we hear a voice. Something is generating those sounds artificially. Barry's scope swept the tree line methodically. Movement at 2 o'clock, he reported. Something large, approximately 100 meters out. It's using the trees for cover, but it's definitely not human. I adjusted my position to get a better view of the area Barry had indicated. Through the gathering darkness, I caught glimpses of something that seemed to flow between the trees rather than walk. It was too large to be human, too fluid to be any animal I recognized, and when it moved, the very air around it seemed to darken. There, Sophia whispered, pointing toward the far side of the meadow. Do you see it? At first, I saw nothing but shadows and the faint glow of starlight filtering through the canopy. Then my eyes adjusted, and I understood why previous teams had been overrun so easily. The entity stood nearly 9 feet tall, its form shifting between solid matter and something that resembled smoke-given substance. Its limbs were too long, its proportions wrong, as if someone had tried to create a human figure from memory and gotten the details slightly wrong. But its eyes burned with an intelligence that was both ancient and malevolent. Jesus Christ, I breathed. He's not available for comment, Eugene said grimly. Light it up. Barry's rifle spoke first. The blessed ammunition striking the entity center mass with a flash of white light that illuminated the entire meadow. The creature staggered but didn't fall, instead letting out a sound that was part roar, part scream, and part something that made my teeth ache. I opened fire, my bullets tracing paths of silver light through the darkness. The entity moved faster than anything that size should be able to move, flowing between the trees like water. But several rounds found their mark. Where the blessed ammunition struck, its form flickered and became more solid, more vulnerable. Sophia had pulled out a device that looked like a modified radio and was broadcasting something that sounded like chanting in a language I'd never heard. Binding frequencies, she explained between transmissions. If we can destabilize its cohesion long enough, the blessed ammunition should be able to. The entity screamed again, and this time the sound carried physical force. Trees swayed as if struck by hurricane winds. Our equipment sparked and failed, and from the darkness around the meadow's perimeter came the sound of multiple footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and approaching from all sides. It's not alone, Barry said, his scope tracking movement through the trees. Multiple contacts, all sides. They've been hurting us. The voices of the missing began again, but this time they were different. These weren't pleas for help. These were warnings. Don't let it touch you, a man's voice called from the darkness. It feeds on more than flesh. It consumes memory, identity, everything that makes you human. Run while you still can, a woman's voice added. We thought we could fight it, We were wrong. It learns from everyone it takes, a third voice said, young, barely more than a child. It knows how you think now, it knows how you'll react. You can't surprise something that has consumed the minds of everyone who ever hunted it. Eugene's face had gone white. Those are the voices of previous recovery team members, he said. The entity doesn't just kill its victims, it preserves their consciousness as part of itself. They're still alive in there, still aware, trapped inside something that uses their knowledge to hunt their replacements. The entity stepped into the meadow, no longer hiding among the trees. In the starlight, I could see that its form was not quite solid, as if it was composed of shadows that had learned to hold a shape. But within that darkness, I could make out other shapes. Human figures trapped beneath the surface like insects in amber. My God, Sophia whispered. It's not just one entity. It's a collective. Every person it's consumed becomes part of its hunting intelligence. The creature spoke then, using the voice of someone I recognized from the case files. Agent Williams, the team leader of the first recovery team that had gone missing 6 months ago. Hello, Eugene, Williams' voice said from the creature's shifting form. I've been waiting for you to come back. We have so much to discuss. Eugene's rifle shook in his hands. Williams was my partner for 3 years, he said. He trained half the recovery teams currently operating. If this thing has access to his knowledge, his tactical experience, his understanding of our protocols, then it knows everything we know, I finished. And it's been planning this encounter since the moment we entered the forest. The entity laughed with Williams' voice, and the sound carried notes of madness that made my skin crawl. We know your strength, your weaknesses, your standard operating procedures. We know about the blessed ammunition, the binding frequencies, the electromagnetic disruptors. We know because Agent Williams helped design them. More shapes emerged from the tree line. Human figures that moved with unnatural coordination, their faces pale and their eyes empty. The missing hikers, the disappeared search teams, everyone who had vanished in this section of forest over the past 6 months. They weren't dead. They were something worse. Fall back, Eugene ordered. But when I turned to retreat, I found our escape room blocked by more of the pale figures. We were surrounded by the missing, controlled by an entity that possessed the collective knowledge of everyone it had consumed. There's nowhere to run, Agent Williams' voice said. We've learned so much from our previous encounters. We've adapted, evolved, become something greater than the sum of our parts. The entity moved closer, and I could see that the human figures trapped within its form were moving too, pressing against the darkness that contained them like drowning swimmers fighting toward the surface. We can offer you a choice, Williams' voice continued. Join us willingly, and you'll retain more of your individual consciousness. Resist, and you'll become just another voice in our collective intelligence. I looked at Eugene, at Sophia, at Barry, and saw my own desperate determination reflected in their faces. We were outgunned, outnumbered, and facing an enemy that knew us better than we knew ourselves, but we were still human, still capable of doing the one thing the entity couldn't predict, making a choice that defied rational survival instinct. Option 3, I said, raising my rifle toward the creature's center mass. We take you with us. Eugene must have recognized the look in my eyes, the same expression I'd worn during the worst firefights in Afghanistan, when the only choice left was to advance toward certain death and hope to do enough damage on the way to matter. He nodded once, then began pulling items from his pack that looked more like religious artifacts than military equipment. Sophia, Barry, he said quietly, when I give the signal, empty everything you have into the primary entity. Don't aim for the human figures, they're victims, not threats. Focus fire on the central mass. What about the controlled hostages? Sophia asked, watching the pale figures of missing hikers advance slowly through the meadow. They're already dead, Eugene said, and the finality in his voice carried the weight of experience I didn't want to contemplate. What's controlling their bodies isn't human anymore. The people they were died the moment the entity consumed them. The creature that had once been Agent Williams laughed with multiple voices now. A choir of the consumed that rose and fell like wind through a graveyard. You still don't understand what you're facing, it said. We are beyond your primitive weapons, beyond your folklore remedies, beyond your capacity to comprehend. Eugene held up a device I hadn't seen during training. A metal cylinder covered in inscriptions that seemed to move in the dim light. Maybe, he said, But you made one mistake. And what was that? You consumed Agent Williams before you fully understood what he was carrying. Eugene triggered the device, and the world exploded in white light. The cylinder in his hands was some kind of electromagnetic pulse generator. But unlike any military hardware I'd encountered, the pulse it generated didn't just disrupt electronics, it disrupted the very cohesion that held the entity together. The creature screamed with 100 voices as its form began to unravel, the darkness that composed its body flickering between solid matter and dispersing shadow. "Now!" Eugene shouted. Barry's sniper rifle spoke first, each blessed round striking the entity's core with flashes that lit up the forest like lightning. Sophia and I followed with sustained fire, our weapons cycling through magazine after magazine of the specialized ammunition. Where our bullets struck, the entity's form solidified, became vulnerable, began to bleed something that looked like liquid starlight. The controlled hostages collapsed as the entity's hold over them weakened, their bodies hitting the ground like marionettes with severed strings. Some of them, the most recently taken, began to stir, their eyes clearing as they regained consciousness. Others lay still, their faces peaceful for the first time since their disappearance. But the entity was far from defeated. As its form destabilized, it began to change, abandoning its attempts to maintain a coherent shape and instead spreading out like a malevolent fog. The temperature plummeted until our breath came in visible clouds. Frost began forming on the trees, and from the spreading darkness came a sound like the universe screaming. "It's dispersing!" Sophia shouted over the noise. "If it fully dissipates, we'll never be able to contain it." Eugene was already moving, pulling a second device from his pack, this one looking like a cross between a radio antenna and a tuning fork. "Binding resonance generator," he said. "Williams helped design it specifically for entities that could change their physical state." He activated the device, and immediately the spreading darkness began to contract, pulled back toward the center of the meadow as if by some invisible force. The entity fought the pull, its voices raised in harmonies of rage and hunger that made my bones ache. "It's working," Barry called out, reloading his rifle. "But for how long?" "Long enough," Eugene said grimly. "Sophia, get on the radio, call for immediate extraction and a containment team. We're going to need specialized equipment to properly secure this thing." But even as the binding field compressed the entity back into a more solid form, I could see it was learning, adapting, finding ways to resist the resonance frequency. The creature that had consumed Agent Williams' knowledge was using that tactical expertise to analyze our equipment, looking for weaknesses, developing countermeasures. "It's figuring out the binding frequency," I said. "Look at how it's moving. It's testing the field strength, probing for weak points." The entity's form had stabilized into something resembling a massive spider made of living shadow, its 8 legs ending in hands that grasped at the air as if trying to find purchase on reality itself. When it spoke, it used the voice of every person it had consumed, creating a cacophony of overlapping words that somehow formed coherent sentences. "You cannot bind what you do not understand," the collective voices said. "We are hunger given form, need made manifest. We have existed since before your species developed language, and we will exist long after your civilization turns to dust." "Maybe," Eugene said, adjusting the resonance generator's frequency. "But not here. Not in my forest." The binding field contracted further, and the entity's struggles became more desperate. But I could see that our equipment was straining under the effort. The electromagnetic pulse generator was smoking. The resonance device was starting to vibrate so violently that Eugene could barely hold it steady. "How long can we maintain this?" I asked. "Not long enough," Eugene admitted. "This equipment was designed for short-term containment until specialized teams could arrive. We need..." The entity suddenly stopped struggling. Its multiple voices fell silent, and in that silence I heard something that chilled my blood. The sound of helicopters approaching through the night sky. "Extraction team?" Sophia asked hopefully. Eugene's face had gone pale. "No," he said. "Our extraction isn't scheduled for another 6 hours, and those aren't recovery team aircraft." The helicopters, 3 of them running without lights, circled the meadow once before descending toward a clearing 200 meters to the south. As they landed, figures in black tactical gear began deploying with the efficiency of a special operations unit. "Who are they?" Barry asked, his scope trained on the newcomers. The entity began to laugh, a sound like breaking glass mixed with screaming wind. Our employers, it said in William's voice. Did you really think the recovery teams were the only government program dealing with entities like us? Eugene lowered the resonance generator, his shoulders sagging with defeat. Acquisition team, he said. They're not here to destroy this thing. They're here to capture it. What? I stared at him in disbelief. Why would anyone want to capture something like this? Think about it, Eugene said bitterly. An entity that can consume human consciousness and retain all their knowledge, skills, and memories. An intelligence that can learn and adapt faster than any human mind. What do you think the military applications would be? The black-clad figures were approaching our position now, weapons raised but not immediately threatening. Their leader, a woman with colonel's insignia, stepped forward with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Agent Vasquez, she said. Stand down. We're assuming custody of the entity. Colonel Morrison, Eugene replied. And I could hear the history between them in his voice. I should have known you'd be behind this. The entity will be transported to a secure facility for study, Morrison continued. Your team will be debriefed and reassigned. This operation is now classified beyond your clearance level. What about the missing people? Sophia demanded. The hikers, the search teams. Some of them are still alive in there. Morrison's expression didn't change. Acceptable losses in the service of national security. The entity's laughter grew louder, more triumphant. They've been feeding us, it said in William's voice, leading victims to our feeding grounds, allowing us to grow stronger, smarter. Also, they could study us, learn from us, find ways to weaponize what we've become. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The convenient funding for the recovery teams, the specific targeting of experienced military personnel and law enforcement officers, the elaborate training that taught us exactly how to find and engage entities like this one. We're bait, I said. We've always been bait, Eugene nodded grimly. The perfect way to feed an intelligence-consuming entity while studying its capabilities. Send in teams of highly trained, knowledgeable personnel and observe how it adapts to each new tactical challenge. Colonel Morrison raised her weapon. Agent Vasquez, you will stand down immediately. That's a direct order. No, Eugene said, raising the resonance generator again. I've spent 12 years cleaning up these messes. I'm not going to let you turn this thing into a weapon. He triggered the device at maximum power, and the binding field collapsed inward with explosive force. The entity screamed as its form was compressed beyond its ability to maintain cohesion, its collective voices rising to a crescendo that shattered trees and sent wildlife fleeing for miles in every direction. Morrison's team opened fire, but it was too late. The entity imploded like a collapsing star, taking with it the darkness that had fed on human consciousness for decades. The pale figures of its victims, those who had been consumed but not yet fully integrated, gasped back to life as their minds were suddenly freed from the collective hunger. In the aftermath, as the surviving hostages stumbled through the meadow in confusion and Morrison's team secured the area with grim efficiency, I understood that this was only the beginning. The entity we destroyed was just one of many. The recovery teams would continue their work, officially hunting these creatures while unofficially feeding them with our own expertise and knowledge. But now I knew the truth. And knowledge, even terrible knowledge, was a form of power. As the helicopters lifted off carrying the survivors and Morrison's disappointed acquisition team, Eugene turned to what remained of our squad. So, he said, who wants to discuss early retirement? I looked at the forest around us, thinking about the other entities still hunting in the deep woods, about the missing people who deserved better than becoming research subjects, about the government programs that treated human lives as acceptable losses in pursuit of weaponizable horrors. Not me, I said. But I think it's time we started hunting the real monsters. Eugene smiled for the first time since I'd met him. Agent Webb, he said, I think you're going to fit in just fine with the actual recovery team. The actual recovery team? The one that doesn't report to Colonel Morrison, he said. The one that Grace has been quietly assembling for the past 3 years. The one that's dedicated to actually recovering the missing instead of feeding them to government research projects. As we gathered our gear and prepared to disappear into the same wilderness that had hidden predators for centuries, I realized that my financial troubles in Detroit felt like problems from another lifetime. The money didn't matter anymore. The comfortable lies didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the knowledge that somewhere in the deep forests of America, things that should not exist were hunting people who deserved protection. And now, finally, they would be hunted in return by people who understood that some sacrifices were too great to make in the name of national security. The real recovery team's work was just beginning. And this time, we would be saving the missing from both the entities that consumed them and the government that considered them expendable. Some hunts are worth the risk. Some monsters need to be faced, regardless of the cost. And sometimes the most dangerous predators wear uniforms and carry government authorization. My name is Ayanna Whitehorse, and I became a park ranger for all the wrong reasons. Not for the noble calling of conservation or the romantic notion of protecting America's wilderness. I took the job because I was running from something much worse than any creature that stalked these mountains. 3 years ago, my partner Detective Marcus Rivera died in my arms after we walked into an ambush during a drug bust gone wrong in Denver. The department cleared me of any wrongdoing, but the guilt ate at me like acid. Every night I heard his voice calling my name, saw his blood spreading across the warehouse floor. The transfer to Glacier National Park's most remote station seemed like salvation. Station 7 sat 40 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by hiking trail or helicopter during good weather. Most rangers considered it punishment duty, but I requested it specifically. The isolation appealed to me. Out here, surrounded by 10 million acres of wilderness, maybe I could finally find some peace. The helicopter dropped me off at the station on a gray October morning, the pilot barely waiting for me to grab my gear before lifting off again. Station 7 consisted of a sturdy log cabin built in the 1960s, a small equipment shed, and a radio tower that connected me to the outside world. Kootenai Lake stretched out before the cabin, its dark waters reflecting the pine-covered mountains that rose like ancient sentinels on all sides. I spent my first week settling into the routine. The cabin was well stocked with supplies to last through the coming winter, though I wouldn't be completely cut off. Every 2 weeks, weather permitting, a supply helicopter would bring fresh provisions and mail. My primary responsibilities included monitoring wildlife, maintaining the trail markers in my sector, and serving as emergency response for any hikers who ventured into this remote corner of the park. The radio crackled to life on my 8th day, dispatching me to assist 2 overdue hikers last seen heading toward the backcountry trails near Kootenai Lake. I loaded my pack with emergency medical supplies, rope, and emergency blankets, then set out on the trail that wound through dense pine forest toward the higher elevations. The forest felt different that morning. Usually the woods hummed with subtle sounds, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the whisper of wind through branches. But as I hiked deeper into the backcountry, an unnatural quiet settled over everything. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I found the hikers 3 hours later, huddled behind a fallen log near a small creek. Both were in their 20s, a couple from Seattle who had clearly underestimated the mountain weather. The woman, who introduced herself as Jenny, was showing early signs of hypothermia. Her boyfriend Kyle had a sprained ankle and was in no condition to help her walk out. "We got lost yesterday afternoon," Kyle explained as I wrapped Jenny in an emergency blanket and started a small fire. "The trail markers just disappeared. We kept following what looked like a path, but it led us in circles." I frowned at this. I had maintained those trail markers myself just 2 weeks ago. "What do you mean they disappeared?" "Gone," Jenny said, her teeth chattering, like someone pulled them down. "And Kyle, tell her about the sounds." Kyle shifted uncomfortably. "You'll think we're crazy, but we heard something following us last night. Footsteps, but not quite right. Too heavy for a person, too deliberate for an animal." I had heard similar reports before, though usually from exhausted hikers whose imagination got the better of them in the wilderness. But as I helped them prepare for the hike back to the station, I noticed something that made me pause. Around the creek where they had been hiding, I found tracks in the soft mud. Large, barefoot human prints, but elongated and wrong somehow. The toes were too long, the stride too wide. Most disturbing were the claw marks at the end of each toe impression. The hike back to Station 7 took longer than expected because of Jenny's condition and Kyle's injured ankle. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the lake blood red. I radioed for medical evacuation and settled the couple in the cabin's main room to wait for the helicopter. That evening, as the medical chopper disappeared into the darkness with my rescued hikers, I stood on the cabin's porch and listened to the forest. The unnatural quiet had followed us back. No owls called, no small animals rustled in the underbrush. Even the lake seemed to hold its surface perfectly still, like black glass reflecting the stars. I went inside and double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. The cabin felt smaller than usual, as if the darkness outside was pressing against the walls. I tried to focus on my evening routine, updating my log, checking equipment, monitoring the weather radio, but my mind kept returning to those tracks by the creek and the way the forest had gone silent. Around midnight, I heard the first sound, a soft scraping like something dragging across the cabin's roof. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch, scanning the roofline. Nothing, but the scraping came again, followed by what sounded like muffled breathing. I called out into the darkness. "Hello? Anyone out there?" The forest swallowed my voice without even an echo. But somewhere in the distance, I heard an answering call. At first, it sounded like my own voice calling back to me. Then it changed, became deeper, more guttural. The call stretched out impossibly long, rising and falling like a wolf's howl, but with an almost human quality that made my skin crawl. I retreated inside and spent the rest of the night sitting at the kitchen table with my service pistol within reach, listening to that terrible voice calling from the darkness. Sometimes it sounded like my name. Sometimes it sounded like Marcus Rivera's voice, calling for help the way he had in that warehouse 3 years ago. By dawn, the forest sounds had returned. Birds sang. A family of raccoons knocked over my trash can. The lake lapped gently against the shore. Everything seemed normal again, except for the deep gouges I found in the cabin's log walls, claw marks that definitely hadn't been there the day before. The regional office response to my incident report was predictably bureaucratic. Bear activity, they concluded. Recommend increased food storage precautions. They ignored my description of the voice and the human-like tracks entirely. I had expected as much. 3 years as a police detective had taught me how institutions dealt with reports that didn't fit neat categories. Over the next week, I tried to establish a new normal. I repaired the damaged trail markers Kyle and Jenny had mentioned, replacing 5 that had been torn down and scattered through the forest. The metal stakes that had held them were bent and twisted with incredible force, as if something had gripped them in powerful hands and wrenched them from the ground. The work kept me busy during daylight hours, but the nights grew increasingly difficult. Every evening brought new sounds from the forest. Footsteps circling the cabin, the scraping sounds on the roof, and always that voice calling from different directions, sometimes mimicking my own words from earlier in the day. I began documenting everything in a private journal separate from my official reports. The sounds followed a pattern. They started around sunset and continued until approximately 3 in the morning. The voice seemed to be learning, getting better at human speech with each passing night. What had begun as wordless howls now included fragments of conversation, my name spoken in different tones and accents. On Thursday, exactly 2 weeks after the helicopter incident, I received a new emergency call. A solo hiker named Brett Morrison had failed to check in at the ranger station in East Glacier. His planned route would have taken him through my sector, specifically the trail system around Kootenai Lake. I set out at first light, following Morrison's documented route. The trail was clearly marked. I had replaced the markers myself. But as I hiked deeper into the backcountry, I began finding evidence of his passage. Candy bar wrappers, a broken bootlace tied around a tree branch, footprints in the mud that matched the boot description from his hiking permit. The trail led me to a small clearing about 5 miles from the cabin, where I found Morrison's backpack hanging from a tree branch 12 feet off the ground. The pack had been slashed open, its contents scattered across the clearing. Camping gear, food supplies, and clothing were strewn about as if something had searched through everything before discarding it. Morrison's hiking boots sat neatly at the base of the tree, unlaced and placed side by side. His socks were folded and placed inside the boots. But there was no sign of Morrison himself. I spent 3 hours searching the area in an expanding grid pattern. I found more of the elongated footprints, this time much clearer than the ones by the creek. The tracks were definitely humanoid but wrong in every detail. Too large, too narrow, with those terrible claw marks at the toe impressions. The stride length suggested something nearly 7 feet tall. More disturbing were the drag marks leading away from the clearing toward the higher elevations. Something heavy had been pulled through the forest, leaving a clear trail of broken branches and disturbed earth. I followed the drag marks for nearly a mile before they disappeared into a rocky area where tracking became impossible. I radioed the incident to the regional office and requested additional search teams. Within hours, helicopters were circling the area while ground teams combed the forest. They found nothing. The official investigation concluded that Morrison had probably fallen into one of the many crevasses or steep ravines that cut through this part of the mountains. His family was told he was presumed dead due to misadventure, but I knew better. I had seen those tracks. I had felt the malevolent intelligence behind the nightly visits to my cabin. Something was hunting in these mountains, something that could mimic human voices and had an appetite for solitary hikers. That night, the sounds outside the cabin were different, more aggressive. The scraping on the roof continued for hours, accompanied by what sounded like sniffing around the doors and windows. The voice that called from the forest now perfectly mimicked Brett Morrison's voice, reading passages from the hiking journal that had been in his backpack. I sat at my kitchen table with my service weapon loaded and ready, listening to Morrison's words being spoken by something that was definitely not human. The voice described his planned route, his excitement about the wilderness photography opportunities, his girlfriend back home in Portland, but underneath Morrison's familiar words was something else. A hunger that made each syllable sound obscene. Around 2 in the morning, the voice changed tactics. Now it was calling in my own voice, begging for help. "Please," it said in perfect imitation of my speech patterns. "I'm hurt. I'm lost. Please help me." I had to bite my lip to keep from responding. Every instinct told me to grab my emergency kit and search for whoever was calling for help. But I had learned to recognize the trap. The voice was too perfect. Too much like a recording of my own distress calls. "Ayana," the voice called, now using Morrison's tone. "I found something in the forest. You need to see this. Come outside, Ayana. Just step onto the porch." I stayed inside and waited for dawn. When morning finally came, I found new evidence of the night's visitation. Deep scratches in the earth around the cabin formed crude symbols. Bones scattered near the porch. Animal bones, but arranged in deliberate patterns, and written in the mud near my front door, formed by what looked like a large finger, was a single word: hungry. I stared at that word for a long time, remembering stories my grandmother had told me about the Wendigo. Ancient Algonquin legends spoke of cannibalistic creatures born from desperate hunger and isolation, humans who had consumed human flesh during harsh winters, transforming into something that was no longer entirely human. Always hungry, always hunting. I had dismissed those stories as folklore, but standing there in the morning light, looking at the evidence of something's nightly visits, I began to reconsider. The Wendigo legends described creatures that could mimic human voices to lure victims into the wilderness. They spoke of beings with an insatiable hunger for human flesh, growing larger and more powerful with each feeding. The pieces fit too well to ignore. The missing hiker, the inhuman tracks, the voice that grew more sophisticated each night. Something was stalking these mountains, and it had decided that I was its next target. I spent that day checking every lock, every window, every possible entry point into the cabin. I cleaned and loaded my spare ammunition. I reviewed emergency protocols and mapped escape routes through the forest. But deep down, I knew that running was not an option. This creature, whatever it was, would follow me anywhere I went. The only way out was through. As sunset approached, I prepared for another long night. But this time I was going to be ready. The attacks escalated over the following week. What had begun as scratching sounds and mimicked voices evolved into something far more terrifying. The creature, whatever it was, had grown bolder and more creative in its attempts to lure me outside. Tuesday night brought the sound of a crying child somewhere in the forest behind the cabin. The voice was heartbreaking, a little girl sobbing and calling for her mother. Every parental instinct demanded that I grab my flashlight and rush into the darkness to help, but I forced myself to stay inside. knowing that no child could possibly be wandering alone in this remote wilderness. The crying continued for 3 hours, moving in a circle around the cabin. Sometimes it came from the direction of the lake, sometimes from the dense pine forest to the north. The voice never tired, never grew hoarse. It maintained the same agonized tone throughout the night, occasionally calling out, "Please help me, I'm so scared, I can't find my mommy." Wednesday night, the creature tried a different approach. Around midnight, I heard helicopter rotors approaching through the valley. My radio crackled to life with what sounded like an emergency dispatch call. "Station 7, this is Search and Rescue Bravo 6. We have a medical emergency inbound. Need immediate ground support for landing zone preparation." I nearly responded. The voice was perfect, exactly matching the radio protocols and call signs used by the Park Service. But something made me hesitate. I checked my duty roster and remembered that no helicopter flights were scheduled for my sector this week. More importantly, I could hear the rotor sounds continuing outside even after the radio transmission ended. An impossibility, since helicopter pilots would need to maintain radio contact during any nighttime approach to my station. I grabbed my binoculars and peered out the cabin windows toward the lake, where any emergency helicopter would attempt to land. Nothing. The rotor sound circled overhead for another hour, accompanied by periodic radio calls requesting my assistance. But no aircraft ever appeared. By Thursday, I was running on perhaps 6 hours of sleep total over 3 days. The constant vigilance was wearing me down, which I suspected was exactly the creature's intention. Exhausted prey makes easier targets. That evening, I received a legitimate radio call that changed everything. "Station 7, this is Regional Dispatch. We have another overdue hiker in your sector. Carson Rivers, male, age 32, failed to check in as scheduled. Last known position was the Kootenai Lake Trail system." I accepted the assignment, knowing I had no choice but to venture into the forest despite the danger. As a park ranger, I had sworn an oath to protect visitors to these mountains. I would not abandon that responsibility, even if it meant walking into the creature's hunting ground. I prepared carefully for the search mission. Extra ammunition for my sidearm, emergency flares, a GPS beacon that would allow headquarters to track my position. Most importantly, I rigged up a small digital recorder to document everything I encountered. If something happened to me, I wanted evidence of what was really stalking these mountains. I began the search at dawn, following the established trail markers toward the backcountry areas where solo hikers typically ventured. The forest felt wrong from the moment I left the cabin. The usual sounds of wildlife were completely absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to muffle even my own footsteps. 3 miles from the station, I found the first sign of Rivers. A water bottle with his name written on the side and permanent marker lay beside the trail, partially hidden under fallen leaves. The bottle was empty but showed no signs of damage. It had been placed deliberately, not dropped accidentally. I continued following the trail, finding more evidence every few hundred yards. A torn piece of fabric caught on a tree branch. A granola bar wrapper weighted down with stones to prevent it from blowing away. Each item seemed positioned to draw me deeper into the forest, further from the safety of my cabin. The trail led me to a steep ravine about 6 miles from Station 7. At the bottom of the ravine, partially hidden by fallen logs and debris, I found Rivers' backpack. Unlike Morrison's gear, this pack was intact and carefully placed, as if someone had gently set it down rather than discarding it violently. I rappelled into the ravine to examine the pack more closely. Rivers' identification and permit were still inside, along with his camping gear and food supplies. Everything was accounted for except Rivers himself and the clothes he had been wearing, but the pack told a story that made my blood run cold. Rivers' journal, found in the main compartment, contained entries describing his hiking experience over the past 3 days. The final entry, dated the previous evening, read, "Something is following me. Started hearing voices yesterday afternoon. People calling for help from different directions in the forest. Tried to help twice but found no one. Now I think the voices are coming from the same source. It sounds like people I know sometimes. Earlier today it sounded exactly like my sister calling my name. Going to hunker down for the night and hope it loses interest." The journal entry ended there, but stuck between the pages I found a photograph that Rivers had apparently taken with his phone. The image showed a dark figure standing among the trees about 50 yards from his campsite. The shape was humanoid but wrong, too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed to bend at impossible angles. Most disturbing were the eyes, which reflected the camera flash like an animal's but burned with an intelligence that was disturbingly human. I climbed out of the ravine with River's pack and began following what looked like drag marks leading away from the area. The trail was easy to follow at first, but after half a mile it became more subtle. Just broken branches and disturbed vegetation that suggested something large had passed through recently. The trail led me higher into the mountains, toward a section of the park I had never explored. The terrain became increasingly difficult, with steep climbs over rocky outcroppings and dense thickets of pine that blocked out most of the daylight. My GPS showed I was moving into the true wilderness, an area with no established trails and no regular human presence. As the afternoon wore on, I began to realize that the creature was leading me exactly where it wanted me to go. The trail was too convenient, too easy to follow. I was being herded toward some predetermined location, probably the creature's lair or feeding ground, but I continued anyway. If there was any chance that Rivers was still alive, I had to try to find him, and on a more personal level, I was tired of being hunted. 3 weeks of sleepless nights and psychological warfare had pushed me beyond fear into a cold anger. If this thing wanted a confrontation, I was ready to give it one. The sun was beginning to set when I finally found what I was looking for. In a small clearing surrounded by ancient pine trees, I discovered the remains of what had once been a hunting cabin. The structure had collapsed decades ago, leaving only the stone foundation and a few rotting wall timbers. But the area around the ruins told a horrific story. Bones were scattered throughout the clearing. Human bones from the size and shape, but many showed signs of being gnawed and cracked open to access the marrow inside. Scraps of fabric and camping gear were strewn about like grisly trophies, and hanging from the tree branches were items that I recognized, pieces of equipment that had belonged to Morrison and Rivers. At the center of the clearing, arranged in a neat pile, were articles of clothing. Recent clothing including a hiking jacket with Carson Rivers' name embroidered on the pocket. I was standing in the creature's feeding ground, surrounded by the remains of its victims. And as the last light faded from the sky, I realized that I was no longer alone in the clearing. The smell hit me first, a nauseating mixture of decay and something else, something that reminded me of a butcher shop left too long without refrigeration. Then came the sound of breathing, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere among the trees that surrounded the clearing. I drew my service weapon and activated my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the tree line. Nothing visible, but I could feel eyes watching me from the darkness beyond the light's reach. The creature was there, studying me, deciding how to proceed. "I know you're there," I called out, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I know what you are." The breathing stopped. For several long seconds, the forest was completely silent. Then, from somewhere behind me came my own voice speaking words I had never said. "Hello, Ayana. I've been waiting for you." I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but saw nothing. The voice continued, coming from different directions as the creature moved through the forest around me. "You've been feeding my children well," it said, still using my voice but with an inflection that was completely wrong. Morrison was young and strong. Rivers was tender. But you will be special. I backed toward the center of the clearing, trying to keep the ruins behind me so nothing could approach from that direction. "Come out where I can see you," I demanded. "Stop hiding in the shadows like a coward." The laughter that answered me was the most horrible sound I had ever heard. It started as my own laugh, but slowly transformed into something else. Deeper, more guttural, with an edge of hunger that made my skin crawl. "You want to see me?" the voice asked, now speaking in Carson Rivers' terrified tones. "Are you certain?" Something massive crashed through the trees at the edge of the clearing. I caught my first clear glimpse of the Wendigo in my flashlight beam, and the sight nearly drove me to my knees. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall and impossibly thin, as if someone had stretched a human form beyond all natural proportions. Its skin was pale gray, almost translucent, stretched tight over bones that protruded at sharp angles. The hands were enormous, with fingers that ended in black claws easily 6 inches long. But it was the face that truly horrified me. The Wendigo had once been human. I could see the remnants of human features beneath the transformation. Eye sockets that were too large, a jaw that had expanded to accommodate rows of yellowed teeth, skin that hung in loose folds around the neck. The eyes burned with intelligence and an endless, desperate hunger. "Beautiful, aren't I?" it said, speaking now in Brett Morrison's voice. "This is what hunger becomes when it has no limits. This is what I offer you." The creature began to circle me, moving with unnatural grace despite its size. I kept my weapon trained on it, though I doubted bullets would have much effect on something that had clearly survived for decades in these mountains. "You're wondering if your little gun will stop me," it said, now mimicking the voice of my dead partner Marcus Rivera. The sound of his words coming from that horrible mouth made my hands shake with rage. "Let me show you what happened to the last ranger who tried to hurt me." The Wendigo reached into the ruins of the cabin and pulled out something that made my blood freeze. A park ranger badge, tarnished with age and stained with something dark. The name engraved on it read J. Beercloud, a ranger who had disappeared in this area over 20 years ago according to the Park Service records I had reviewed. "Jeremy put up quite a fight," the creature said, still using Marcus's voice. "But in the end he screamed just like all the others, just like you will scream." It charged. I fired 3 shots center mass as the Wendigo rushed toward me. The bullets struck home. I could see the impacts, but they barely slowed the creature down. Its claws raked across my chest as I threw myself sideways, shredding my jacket and leaving deep scratches in the Kevlar vest underneath. I rolled away and came up firing, emptying the rest of my magazine into the creature's torso and head. The Wendigo staggered but kept coming, its horrible mouth opened wide to reveal multiple rows of teeth designed for tearing flesh from bone. I drew my backup weapon, a .357 revolver loaded with hollow-point rounds, and put 2 shots into the creature's face at point-blank range. This time the impact was dramatic. The Wendigo's head snapped back and it stumbled, dark blood streaming from its shattered jaw, but it didn't fall. Instead, it began to laugh, spraying blood with each horrible chuckle. "Iron and lead," it gasped, still speaking in Marcus's voice. "The white man's medicine, but I am older than your weapons, little ranger. I am hunger itself." The Wendigo lunged again, and this time I wasn't fast enough to avoid its claws entirely. I felt them slice through my left shoulder, tearing muscle and sending hot blood streaming down my arm. The pain was incredible, but it also triggered my police training. I had been in life-or-death situations before. I knew how to function while wounded. I backpedaled toward the tree line, looking for anything I could use as cover or a weapon. The Wendigo followed, moving with deliberate slowness now, confident that I was trapped and wounded. It was savoring the hunt. "Tell me about Detective Rivera," it said, blood still dripping from its ruined mouth. "Tell me how he died in your arms. Tell me how you failed to save him." The psychological attack was as vicious as the physical assault. But it also made a crucial mistake. By using Marcus's death against me, the creature reminded me why I had come to these mountains in the first place. I was already haunted by my partner's death. I was already carrying that guilt. The Wendigo couldn't hurt me with something I had been living with for 3 years. Instead of breaking me down, the taunt made me angry. Cold, focused, deadly angry. I still had 3 rounds left in the revolver. I also had emergency flares in my pack, and I remembered something from my grandmother's stories about the Wendigo. Fire. The legend said they feared fire above all else. I pulled out a flare and ignited it, the red light casting dancing shadows across the clearing. The Wendigo immediately backed away, its confidence shaken for the first time. "You remember the old stories," it hissed, now speaking in a voice I didn't recognize, probably one of its other victims. "But fire alone will not save you. I have survived controlled burns, lightning strikes, forest fires. I am patient, I will wait," but I wasn't planning to just threaten it with the flare. I had a different idea entirely. The ruins of the old cabin included a stone fireplace with a chimney that still stood partially intact. More importantly, I could see the gleam of metal among the debris, probably old cans, camping equipment, and other items that wouldn't burn. I reached into my pack and pulled out all my remaining flares, 6 emergency road flares designed to burn at over 2,000 degrees. If I could get the Wendigo into an enclosed space and ignite all the flares simultaneously, the heat might be enough to kill it. The trick was getting it to follow me into the ruins. "You want me?" I called out, backing toward the fireplace. "Come and take me." The Wendigo studied me for a long moment, its predatory intelligence weighing the trap it sensed against its overwhelming hunger. Hunger won. It charged again, and this time I was ready. I dove through the collapsed doorway of the ruined cabin just as the Wendigo's claws whistled through the air where my head had been. The creature was too large to follow me easily through the opening, which gave me precious seconds to implement my desperate plan. I scattered all 6 flares around the small interior space of the ruins and ignited them simultaneously. The enclosed area filled with brilliant red light and almost unbearable heat. Then I pressed myself against the back wall of the fireplace and waited. The Wendigo forced its way through the doorway, tearing away rotted timber and stone as it came. For a moment it paused at the threshold, sensing the trap. But its hunger overrode its caution, and it lunged toward me with those terrible claws extended. The concentrated heat from 6 military-grade flares in an enclosed space was devastating. The creature's pale skin began to smoke and blister almost immediately. It screamed, a sound like nothing I had ever heard, inhuman yet filled with very human agony. The stench of burning flesh filled the air, but the Wendigo was tougher than I had hoped. Even as its skin charred and peeled away, it continued trying to reach me. Its claws raked the stone wall inches from my face, leaving deep gouges in the rock. I emptied my remaining rounds into its head and chest at point-blank range, the muzzle flashes adding their light to the hellish red glow of the flares. This time, with the creature weakened by fire, the bullets had more effect. The Wendigo staggered backward, its movements becoming uncoordinated. "You cannot kill hunger itself," it gasped, its voice now a horrible rasp. "There will always be others. The winter makes them. The desperation feeds them. The forest births them." The creature was dying, but it was trying to plant one final seed of fear in my mind. I refused to let it win. "Maybe," I said, watching it collapse among the burning flares. "But I can kill you." The Wendigo made one last attempt to reach me, lunging forward with its remaining strength. But the fire had done its work. The creature fell short, its body finally succumbing to the heat and trauma. It lay writhing among the flares for several more minutes before becoming still. I stayed pressed against the wall until all the flares burned out, leaving me in darkness broken only by the soft glow of embers from the Wendigo's charred remains. The smell was indescribable, burned meat mixed with something else, something rotten that made my stomach heave. When I was certain the creature was dead, I activated my emergency beacon and called for immediate extraction. The radio operator sounded confused by my request for a priority helicopter evacuation, but the urgency in my voice must have convinced him. Within an hour, I could hear rotors approaching through the valley. The helicopter crew found me sitting outside the ruins, my wounded shoulder roughly bandaged, staring at the smoking remains inside the collapsed cabin. I told them I had been attacked by a bear and managed to drive it off with flares. They accepted the story without question. It was more believable than the truth. The medical team at the regional hospital treated my injuries and recommended a week of administrative leave to recover from the bear attack. I agreed readily, knowing I needed time to process what had happened and decide how much to include in my official report. During my recovery, I researched the park's historical records more thoroughly. What I found disturbed me almost as much as my encounter with the Wendigo itself. Over the past 50 years, Glacier National Park had experienced an unusually high number of mysterious disappearances, solo hikers who vanished without trace, campers who were found dead with injuries that couldn't be explained by normal predator attacks. Most disturbing, several other park rangers had disappeared or died under strange circumstances in the same sector where I had been stationed. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. The Wendigo I had killed was probably not the first of its kind to hunt in these mountains. The creature had spoken of children and others, suggesting that there might be more of them scattered throughout the wilderness. I also found references to similar disappearances in other remote wilderness areas across North America: the Pacific Northwest, the Canadian Rockies, the Alaskan interior, anywhere that provided vast expanses of untouched forest where people could disappear without trace. The Wendigo legends were not just folklore. They were warnings passed down through generations of indigenous peoples who had learned to recognize and avoid these creatures. But modern society had forgotten the warnings, dismissing them as primitive superstition. When I returned to duty, I submitted a carefully worded report that described my encounter as a defensive shooting involving a large, aggressive bear. I included details about finding evidence of the missing hikers and recommended that the area be temporarily closed to public access for safety reasons. The Park Service accepted my recommendations and established a temporary closure around the Kootenai Lake backcountry. Officially, this was due to increased bear activity. Unofficially, it would prevent other hikers from stumbling into whatever remained of the Wendigo's feeding ground. I requested a transfer to a different station, one closer to civilization and regular contact with other rangers. My superiors approved the transfer without question, assuming I was suffering from post-traumatic stress after my bear attack. They weren't entirely wrong. I do have nightmares about my encounter with the Wendigo, but they're not the helpless, terrifying dreams you might expect. Instead, I dream about the other creatures that might still be out there, hunting in the deep wilderness where humans rarely venture. I dream about the hikers and campers who trust in the safety of our national parks, unaware that some of our most remote areas harbor dangers that predate human civilization. I dream about my responsibility to protect them, even when the threat exists beyond the boundaries of what people are willing to believe. I still work as a park ranger, but now I carry different equipment. Silver bullets made from melted jewelry, a small arsenal of emergency flares, a detailed knowledge of folklore and legends from across North America, and most importantly, a willingness to act when others would dismiss warning signs as imagination or natural phenomena. Because I learned something in that burning cabin among the ruins of the Wendigo's feeding ground. The old stories are true, or at least some of them are. The creatures our ancestors feared still walk in the wild places of the world. They still hunt, they still hunger, and sometimes it falls to people like me to make sure they don't feed. 3 months after my encounter at Station 7, I received a report about strange disappearances in Yellowstone's backcountry. Solo hikers vanishing without trace, voices calling for help from deep in the forest, wildlife avoiding certain areas entirely. I volunteered for the assignment immediately. The work continues. My name is Sarah Chen, and until 6 months ago, I was drowning in student debt in Portland, Oregon, working 3 part-time jobs just to keep my studio apartment. Fresh out of college with a degree in anthropology and folklore studies, I was serving coffee by day, tutoring kids in the evening, and doing data entry at night. The $127,000 in loans felt like a mountain I'd never climb, especially when my car broke down and I couldn't afford the repairs. That's when the recruitment letter arrived. The envelope bore no return address, just my name in serif font on cream-colored paper. Inside, a single page invited me to an interview for a specialized research position with the Department of Interior. The salary figure made me blink twice: $95,000 annually, plus benefits, housing allowance, and loan forgiveness program. I should have been suspicious. Instead, I was desperate. The interview took place in a nondescript office building in downtown Portland. The woman who met me, Agent Victoria Blackwood, was maybe 40, with steel gray hair and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. She wore a charcoal suit and spoke in measured tones. "Miss Chen, your academic background is unique," she said, reviewing my file. "Folklore studies with a minor in criminal psychology. You've written papers on contemporary legends and their sociological impact." "Yes, ma'am. Tell me about your thesis on missing persons cases in national forests." I shifted in my chair. I researched patterns in unexplained disappearances, particularly cases where search and rescue teams found inconsistent evidence. Clothing torn in ways that don't match animal attacks, personal items found miles from last known locations, that sort of thing. Victoria nodded. "And your conclusion?" "That there are more questions than answers. The cases don't fit standard explanations, but they do follow certain patterns. Almost like there are rules governing what happens even if we don't understand them." "Rules," she repeated. "Interesting perspective." She closed my file. "Miss Chen, what I'm about to tell you is classified. The Department of Interior operates a specialized division that investigates missing persons cases in federal lands, cases that fall outside conventional parameters. We call it the Missing Division." My heart hammered. You mean like the unexplained cases I studied? Exactly like those cases. We need researchers who can think beyond conventional explanations. People who understand that sometimes the old stories exist for a reason. The offer was straightforward. Join a team of specialists who investigate disappearances in national forests and wilderness areas, travel to remote locations, apply my folklore knowledge to real-world situations. The pay was exactly what the letter promised, with the addition that all expenses would be covered and housing provided at each assignment location. I signed the papers that afternoon. Training took place at a facility in Virginia I'm not permitted to name. For 6 weeks I learned tactical basics, how to use GPS devices, satellite phones, basic first aid, wilderness survival. More importantly, I studied case files that made my academic research look tame. David Kim, former Park Service ranger, disappeared in Olympic National Forest. His campsite showed no signs of struggle, but his boots were found neatly placed by the river, laces still tied. The search dogs refused to track beyond that point. Maria Santos vanished in the Great Smoky Mountains. Her hiking companions reported she walked around a bend in the trail ahead of them. When they followed 30 seconds later, she was gone. They found her backpack hanging from a branch 20 feet above the trail, a branch too thin to support an adult's weight. 12-year-old Tommy Wright went missing in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. 3 days later, searchers found him sitting in a clearing, unharmed but unable to remember anything after leaving his family's cabin. He kept drawing pictures of tall, thin figures made of twisting branches and shadows. The common thread, explained Dr. Eugene Marsh, the division's lead researcher, is that conventional explanations fail. No evidence of foul play, no animal attacks, no accidents that make sense, but there are patterns if you know how to look. During my final week of training, I met my field partner, Agent Harold Vance, a former military policeman who transitioned to federal law enforcement. Harold was built like a linebacker, with graying temples and a no-nonsense demeanor that masked a surprisingly deep knowledge of American folklore. "Don't let the stories scare you," he said during our first briefing. "But don't dismiss them either. The thing about folklore is that it survives for a reason. People don't pass down tales about made-up monsters for generations unless those tales serve a purpose." Our first assignment came in early March. Investigate a cluster of disappearances in North Carolina's Pisgah National Forest. 4 hikers had vanished over the past 2 months, all experienced outdoors people who knew the terrain. Local search and rescue teams were baffled. As our plane descended into Asheville, I looked out at the ancient mountains rolling endlessly toward the horizon. Somewhere in those forests, people had vanished without explanation. And now it was my job to find answers in the space between folklore and fact. Harold noticed my expression. Having second thoughts, I thought about my empty bank account, my studio apartment with the broken radiator, the 3 jobs that barely paid enough to survive. Then I thought about Tommy Wright's drawings and Maria Santos's backpack hanging from an impossible branch. "No," I said, "I'm ready." But as we drove through the winding mountain roads toward our base camp, surrounded by trees older than recorded history, I wondered if anyone could truly be ready for what waited in the deep woods. The missing persons files had taught me one thing. In these places, the rules were different, and breaking those rules could cost you everything. The forest was watching. I could feel it. Our base of operations was a ranger station 20 miles outside Brevard, North Carolina. The building sat in a clearing surrounded by towering hemlocks and white pines, their branches creating a canopy so thick that even midday felt like dusk. Agent Victoria Blackwood had flown in to personally brief us, along with local Park Service Supervisor Craig Morrison. 4 disappearances in 8 weeks, Victoria said, spreading topographical maps across the station's main table. All experienced hikers, all in this sector. She traced a red circle encompassing roughly 30 square miles of wilderness. Craig shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "My people have been over every inch of that area. Standard search protocols, dogs, helicopter surveys, nothing." Harold studied the map. "Tell us about the missing persons." First was Rebecca Martinez, 28, from Charlotte. Solo hiker, very experienced. She checked in at the Cradle of Forestry Visitor Center on January 15th, planned a 3-day backcountry trip, never returned to her vehicle. Victoria flipped through photographs. Her tent was found pitched properly, no signs of disturbance, sleeping bag still in place, food properly stored. But her hiking boots were missing and there were unusual markings around the campsite. What kind of markings? I asked. Craig pulled out additional photos. Scratches in tree bark, maybe 8 feet off the ground. Too high for Rebecca to make, too organized to be from animals. And the pattern. He paused. Well, it looked almost like symbols. My folklore training kicked in. Can you describe the symbols? Spirals, mostly, connected by straight lines. My rangers said it looked like something kids might carve, except kids don't generally make it 8 feet up a tree trunk. Victoria continued through the files. Second disappearance was Marcus Webb, 34, experienced climber from Raleigh. He was with a group attempting a technical climb on Looking Glass Rock. His companions reported he went to scout an alternate route and never returned. Equipment? Harold asked. Left behind. Climbing gear, ropes, even his water bottle. Like he just walked away from everything. The third case was Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a botanist from the University of North Carolina studying old-growth forest ecosystems. She'd been documenting rare plant species in remote sections of the forest when she vanished. Her research notes were recovered, Victoria said. The last entry is unusual. She handed me a photocopy of handwritten notes. The writing started normal, detailing plant specimens and GPS coordinates, but toward the end became increasingly erratic. Something wrong with the trees in section 7G. They're arranged in patterns that don't occur naturally. Spirals, concentric circles, almost like crop circles but in a forest canopy. The local Cherokee name for this area translates to where the tall ones dance. Need to research further. The shadows are moving wrong. Shadows don't move at midday. They don't move at midday. They don't. The entry ended mid-sentence. Harold frowned. Cherokee name? Craig nodded grimly. That's what brought us to the fourth case. When Jennifer disappeared, I consulted with tribal elders from the Eastern Band. They were reluctant to discuss this area. The fourth disappearance was the most recent. Timothy Allen, 16, who'd been participating in a wilderness survival program for at-risk youth. He vanished during a supervised camping trip despite being checked on every 2 hours. The counselors swear he was in his sleeping bag at midnight, Victoria said. At 2 a.m. the bag was empty. No sounds, no disturbance, like he evaporated. I studied the map, noting the locations of each disappearance. They formed a rough semicircle around a particular valley marked as restricted access research area. What's special about that restricted zone? Craig hesitated. Officially, it's a protected watershed. Unofficially, he glanced at Victoria, who nodded for him to continue. It's the area the Cherokee elders warned us about. They say it's been off limits for generations. Harold leaned back in his chair. What exactly did the tribal elders tell you? They called it NVEFSD, the place where they stand tall. According to their stories, it's inhabited by beings they call the Tall Walkers. Spirits or entities that appear as impossibly tall, thin figures made of shadow and branches. The stories say they steal people who venture too close to their sacred places. Victoria closed the files. Which brings us to your assignment. Sarah, your folklore research suggested these cases might follow patterns based on traditional beliefs. Harold, your experience with missing persons in federal lands makes you invaluable for the investigative approach. So what's the plan? Harold asked. You'll establish a forward camp in the restricted zone tomorrow. Full documentation of any anomalies. If these disappearances are connected to local folklore, we need to understand the rules governing them. That night I couldn't sleep. My temporary quarters in the ranger station felt cramped and exposed despite the thick walls. Every sound from the forest seemed amplified. Wind through branches, distant owl calls, the occasional crack of settling timber. I pulled out my laptop and researched Cherokee folklore about the Tall Walkers. The stories were consistent across multiple sources. Beings that appeared at the edge of vision, impossibly tall and thin, moving through forests in ways that defied explanation. They were said to be guardians of sacred places, taking those who trespassed or showed disrespect to the land. But the stories also mentioned rules. The Tall Walkers supposedly couldn't approach those who showed proper reverence, who understood their place in the natural order. They were most active during the liminal times, dawn, dusk, the spaces between full moon and new moon. At 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep and walked to the station's main room. Harold was there, cleaning his service weapon with methodical precision. "Can't sleep either?" I asked. "Not before a mission in unknown territory." He looked up. "You having second thoughts about this assignment?" I considered the question seriously. The missing persons cases were genuinely frightening, and the folklore implications suggested we might be dealing with something beyond conventional understanding. But I thought about my student loans, my cramped apartment in Portland, the endless cycle of minimum wage jobs with no future. "No," I said finally. "This is the first time in my life I felt like my education actually matters. Like what I studied might help people." Harold nodded approvingly. "Good attitude. Just remember, out there, respect Trump's skepticism. If the stories are true, our survival might depend on following rules we don't fully understand." Outside, the forest rustled in a wind I couldn't feel. Somewhere in those ancient woods, 4 people had vanished without explanation. Tomorrow, Harold and I would venture into their territory, guided by folklore and armed with modern equipment, searching for answers that might exist in the space between myth and reality. The tall walkers, if they existed, were waiting. We entered the restricted zone at dawn, our packs loaded with GPS units, satellite phones, cameras, and enough supplies for 3 days. The morning mist hung between the trees like veils, and our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the carpet of fallen leaves. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No bird calls, no insect buzz, no small animal sounds that typically filled forest spaces. Just the whisper of wind through branches and the soft percussion of our boots on the trail. "This is wrong," Harold said after an hour of hiking. He'd been growing increasingly tense as we moved deeper into the zone. "What do you mean?" "The wildlife. Forests this healthy should be full of animal sounds, but nothing's making noise." He paused, studying the canopy above us. "It's like they're all hiding." I pulled out my digital camera and began documenting our surroundings. Through the viewfinder, I noticed something that made me stop abruptly. "Harold, look at the trees." He followed my gaze. The large oaks and hickories surrounding us weren't randomly distributed as they should be in natural forest. They formed subtle patterns, clusters, and clearings that created rough geometric shapes when viewed from the right angle. "Spirals," I said, pointing to where the tree placement created a loose spiral pattern around a central clearing. Just like Dr. Walsh described in her notes. We approached the clearing carefully. It was perfectly circular, maybe 30 feet across, with bare earth that showed no signs of recent vegetation. At the center stood a single dead tree, its branches reaching upward like skeletal fingers. Harold pulled out his GPS unit. "Marking this location, we need to..." He stopped mid-sentence. The GPS display showed only static. "Equipment malfunction?" I asked. "Maybe." He checked his satellite phone. The signal indicator showed no bars. "Or something's interfering with our electronics." I walked the perimeter of the clearing, taking photographs. Through my camera lens, I noticed scratches in the bark of surrounding trees, the same spiral symbols Craig had described from Rebecca Martinez's campsite. But these were older, weathered by seasons of exposure. "These markings aren't recent," I said. "Some of them look decades old." Harold joined me at the tree line. "Which means whatever's been happening here didn't start with our 4 missing persons." We set up camp at the edge of the clearing, following protocols designed to minimize our environmental impact. As afternoon turned to evening, the forest remained unnaturally quiet. But as darkness approached, that changed. The first sound was barely audible, a rustling that could have been wind through leaves, but there was no wind. The air hung still and heavy around our camp. "You hear that?" Harold whispered. I nodded. The rustling was growing more distinct, and with it came other sounds. Soft scraping, like branches dragging across bark. Occasional cracks, as if something very large was moving carefully through the underbrush. Harold reached for his flashlight, but I stopped him. "The stories say they're most active in darkness," I said. "But also that bright lights can provoke them. So what do we do?" I thought about the Cherokee tales I'd researched. We show respect. We acknowledge their presence without challenging them. The sound circled our camp, staying just beyond the range of our small campfire. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, tall shapes that seemed to meld with the tree shadows. When I looked directly, nothing was there. Around midnight, the sound stopped abruptly. The silence returned, deeper than before. Harold and I sat back to back, alert and listening. That's when I saw it. At the far edge of our fire's illumination stood a figure. Impossibly tall and thin, it appeared to be composed of twisted branches and shadow. It didn't move with the fluid motion of a living creature, but with the slow, deliberate sway of a tree in wind. "Harold," I breathed. "I see it." The figure stood motionless for perhaps 5 minutes, watching us. Then, without any sound, it faded back into the darkness between the trees. "Did that just happen?" Harold asked. Before I could answer, our campfire died. Not gradually, as fires normally do when they run out of fuel, but all at once, as if someone had thrown a blanket over it. We were plunged into absolute darkness. I heard Harold fumbling for his flashlight, but I grabbed his wrist. "Don't," I whispered. "Not yet." In the darkness, the sounds returned. But now they were closer, much closer. I could hear breathing that wasn't quite breathing, a rhythmic whisper like wind through hollow reeds. Something large moved around our tent, circling slowly. Then came voices. "Help me." The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakably human. Female. "Please, someone help me." Another voice, this one male and younger. Harold tensed beside me. Those could be our missing persons. "I'm lost." A third voice, barely audible. "I can't find my way back." The voices seemed to come from different directions, circling our camp just as the footsteps had done. But there was something wrong with them, a hollow quality that made them sound like recordings played through damaged speakers. "Sarah," Harold whispered, "we need to respond. If those are survivors..." "No." I held his arm firmly. "Listen to the Cherokee stories. The tall walkers can mimic human voices. They use them to lure people deeper into the forest." The voices continued for another hour, sometimes pleading, sometimes just calling out names. I recognized some of them from our missing persons files: Rebecca, Marcus, Jennifer, Timothy, but the voices never got closer or farther away, maintaining the same distance from our camp. As dawn approached, the voices faded. Our equipment began working again. Harold's GPS unit showed our exact coordinates, and the satellite phone registered full signal strength. "What the hell did we experience last night?" Harold asked as we broke camp. I packed my camera carefully, thinking about the figure I'd photographed in the darkness. "Contact," I said. "We made contact with something that's been taking people from these woods for a very long time." As we hiked back toward the ranger station, I noticed fresh spiral markings carved into trees along our path. The cuts were clean and recent, made sometime during the night while we were in the clearing. The tall walkers had marked our passage. They knew we were here. Back at the ranger station, I developed my photographs while Harold filed his initial report. Most of the images showed normal forest scenes, but 3 photographs captured anomalies that made my hands shake as I examined them. The first showed the tall figure at the edge of our campfire's light, but in the photograph it appeared even more disturbing than it had in person. Its limbs twisted at impossible angles, and its height was clearly inhuman, at least 9 feet tall, with arms that reached nearly to the ground. The second photograph was taken during the voices. The image showed our camp in darkness, but there were shapes in the background, multiple tall figures standing between the trees. I counted at least 6 distinct forms, all watching our tent. The third photograph was the most unsettling. I had taken it during the day, before we'd encountered anything unusual, but when developed it showed spiral markings carved into a tree that I was certain had been unmarked when I photographed it. Somehow the markings had appeared in the developed image despite not being visible when I took the shot. Harold studied the photographs grimly. "These things aren't just folklore." Agent Victoria Blackwood arrived that afternoon, accompanied by Dr. Eugene Marsh and a woman I hadn't met before, Dr. Claire Novak, a cultural anthropologist specializing in indigenous American traditions. Victoria spread our photographs across the briefing table. "These images confirm what we suspected. You made direct contact with entities that have been documented in this region for centuries." Dr. Novak leaned forward. "I've been researching Cherokee oral traditions about this area. The NVEFSD stories are older than European colonization, but they've remained remarkably consistent across generations. The tall walkers are described as guardians of sacred spaces, places where the boundary between worlds is thin. Boundary between worlds? I asked. Many indigenous traditions describe locations where the physical world intersects with spiritual realms. These places often exhibit unusual phenomena and are considered dangerous to those who don't understand the proper protocols. Harold pointed to the photograph showing multiple figures. So these things are spiritual entities? That's one interpretation, Dr. Marsh said. But they also exhibit physical characteristics. They leave markings, they affect electronic equipment, they can be photographed. Whatever they are, they exist in our reality as well as others. Victoria stood and walked to a large map of the southeastern United States. The Missing Division has investigated similar cases in Oregon's Cascade Range, Michigan's Upper Peninsula, Pennsylvania's Allegheny Forest, and Wisconsin's Northwoods. All share common elements: ancient forests, indigenous folklore about tall, thin guardians, and missing persons cases that defy explanation. You're saying this is a national phenomenon? I asked. Regional clusters, at least. Each area has its own variation of the folklore, but the basic pattern is consistent, and in each case the entities seem to follow rules. Dr. Novak nodded. The Cherokee stories emphasize that the tall walkers aren't malevolent in human terms. They're protective of their territory, but they follow specific behavioral patterns. Understanding those patterns might be key to preventing future disappearances. She pulled out a notebook filled with handwritten transcriptions. According to tribal elders, the tall walkers take people who violate certain taboos, entering sacred areas without permission, damaging the forest environment, or showing disrespect to the land. But they also take people who become lost in the deepest woods, particularly during liminal times. What kind of liminal times? Harold asked. Dawn, dusk, the new moon, times when the boundary between worlds is thinnest. People who become lost during these periods are more likely to cross over into the tall walker's realm. I thought about our missing persons. Rebecca Martinez disappeared during a new moon weekend. Marcus Webb vanished at dusk. Jennifer Walsh's last research entry was dated just before dawn. Victoria pulled out additional files. Which brings us to Timothy Allen. The wilderness survival counselors reported checking on him at midnight, traditionally a liminal time in many cultures. Dr. Marsh leaned back in his chair. If these entities are following rules based on folklore, then understanding those rules might allow us to negotiate. Negotiate? Harold looked skeptical. With forest spirits? Think of it as cultural diplomacy, Dr. Novak said. Indigenous traditions often describe successful interactions with non-human entities. Rituals, offerings, demonstrations of respect. If the tall walkers are guardians protecting sacred space, then approaching them as guardians might change the dynamic. Victoria closed the files. Which brings us to your next assignment. The Cherokee elders have agreed to meet with us tomorrow. They'll share traditional protocols for safely entering NVEFSD. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something crucial. The photographs, the voice recordings Harold had made, the electronic interference, all pointed to entities that were far more complex than simple folklore spirits. I pulled out my laptop and began cross-referencing disappearance patterns with lunar cycles, weather conditions, and geographical features. A pattern emerged that made me call Harold to my room at midnight. Look at this, I said, showing him my analysis. Every disappearance occurred within 3 days of a new moon, during weather conditions that created heavy forest shadows. And they all happened in areas where the topography creates natural acoustic anomalies. Harold studied my charts. Acoustic anomalies? Places where sound carries strangely. Echo chambers, dead zones, areas where voices can travel much farther than they should. I pulled up a topographical overlay. The locations where people heard the voices, where electronic equipment malfunctioned, they're all in geological formations that would amplify and distort sound. Harold was quiet for a long moment. You're suggesting these entities use natural acoustic properties as part of their hunting behavior? I'm suggesting they understand their environment better than we do. The spiral markings, the arranged trees, the timing of appearances, It's all connected to natural phenomena that most people wouldn't notice. Outside our window, the forest stretched endlessly into darkness. Somewhere in those woods, 4 people remained missing, possibly alive in whatever realm the tall walkers inhabited. Tomorrow we would learn whether traditional Cherokee protocols could help us bring them home. But tonight, studying the photographs of those impossible tall figures watching our camp, I wondered if some disappearances were meant to remain mysterious, if some boundaries between worlds were meant to stay closed. The tall walkers were still out there, following rules we barely understood, protecting secrets older than recorded history, and we were about to ask them for safe passage into their sacred space. Elder Joseph Sequoia arrived at dawn, accompanied by his granddaughter Emma and 2 other tribal members I was introduced to as traditional knowledge keepers. Elder Sequoia was a man in his 70s with silver hair braided down his back and eyes that seemed to hold decades of accumulated wisdom. He listened without interruption as Harold and I described our encounter in the restricted zone. When we finished, he sat in silence for several minutes before speaking. "You were fortunate," he said finally. "The NVEFSD allowed you to leave because you showed respect. You didn't try to follow the voices, you didn't challenge them with bright lights, and you acknowledged their presence without demanding proof of their reality." Dr. Novak leaned forward. "Elder Sequoia, would you be willing to share the traditional protocols for entering their territory safely?" The elder exchanged glances with his companions. "These protocols exist to protect both humans and the tall walkers. They are not tourist guidelines or academic curiosities. They are sacred compacts between peoples." "We understand," Victoria said. "Our goal is to locate the missing persons and prevent future disappearances. We're not seeking to exploit or expose the tall walkers." Emma spoke for the first time. "My grandfather has agreed to teach you because the missing people include innocents who violated the compact unknowingly. But you must commit to following our guidance completely." We agreed. Elder Sequoia spread a cloth on the table and placed several items on it. A small pouch of what looked like tobacco, a piece of carved bone, and several stones arranged in a specific pattern. "The tall walkers are the guardians of places where ancestors walked between worlds," he began. "They appear as they do because they exist partially in the spirit realm, where physical form is more fluid. They are not evil, but they are not human, and they do not think as humans do." He picked up the tobacco pouch. "Traditional offerings demonstrate respect and peaceful intention, but more important than any object is the proper mindset. You must enter their territory as guests, not investigators. You must be prepared to accept their judgment of your worthiness." Harold shifted uncomfortably. "What if they judge us unworthy?" "Then you join the missing," Emma said simply. Elder Sequoia continued the instruction for 3 hours, detailing specific protocols for entering the restricted zone. The proper offerings to leave at threshold trees, the traditional words to speak when encountering the tall walkers, the importance of moving only during appropriate times, and the absolute necessity of accepting whatever outcome they determined. "Most importantly," he concluded, "you must understand that some who disappear choose not to return. The realm of the tall walkers offers sanctuary to those who no longer fit in the modern world. You cannot rescue someone who has found their true home." That afternoon, Harold and I prepared for our return to the restricted zone. We packed the traditional offerings and practiced the Cherokee phrases Elder Sequoia had taught us. Victoria provided updated communication equipment and emergency extraction protocols, though Elder Sequoia had warned that modern technology would be unreliable in the deepest part of tall walker territory. We entered the forest at dusk, timing our arrival to coincide with the liminal period when the boundary between worlds was most permeable. This time I felt a different quality to the silence, not absence of life but presence of something vast and watchful. At the first threshold tree, a massive oak marked with natural spiral patterns in its bark, we stopped and performed the offering ritual. I placed tobacco at the base of the tree and spoke the traditional words Elder Sequoia had taught us. "We come in peace, seeking the lost ones. We ask permission to pass through your sacred place. We offer respect to the guardians of this realm." The temperature dropped noticeably. Our breath became visible in the suddenly cold air, and from somewhere ahead in the darkness came a sound like wind chimes made of bone. Harold met my eyes. "I guess that's a yes." We moved deeper into the restricted zone, following traditional protocols. No direct light sources, minimal talking, and careful attention to the natural signs around us. The trees seemed to grow taller and closer together as we walked, their canopy blocking out the stars. At the circular clearing where we'd camped before, the tall walkers were waiting. 7 of them stood around the perimeter, each at least 9 feet tall, their forms shifting between shadow and substance. In the center of the clearing, near the dead tree, 4 human figures sat in a circle. Rebecca Martinez looked up as we approached. "Are you here to take us back?" Her voice was calm, distant, but recognizably human. The other 3, Marcus Webb, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, and Timothy Allen, showed no signs of distress or captivity. They appeared to be participating in some kind of ongoing ceremony with the tall walkers. "We're here to bring you home," Harold said carefully. Dr. Walsh shook her head. "This is home now. The research I was doing, it was all wrong. I was trying to study the forest as a collection of separate organisms, but it's a single entity, a living system that includes the tall walkers as its consciousness." Marcus Webb stood and walked toward us. "I fell while climbing and should have died. They saved me, brought me here. This place exists outside normal time. I've learned more about myself in the past 2 months than in my entire life before." Timothy Allen, the 16-year-old, looked the most conflicted. "I want to see my family again," he said, "but I also understand now why I never fit in anywhere else. This place accepts me as I am." The largest of the tall walkers approached us. When it spoke, its voice was like wind through hollow reeds, but the words were clear. "The compact allows choice. Those who wish to return may return. Those who wish to remain may remain. But the choice once made is final." Harold stepped forward. "We respect the compact. We ask that you allow Timothy to return with us. He's still a minor, still learning who he is." The tall walker considered this. After several minutes, it nodded. "The young one may choose again when he reaches full maturity. Until then, he will return with you." Timothy looked torn, but he joined us at the edge of the clearing. Rebecca, Marcus, and Dr. Walsh remained with the tall walkers. As we prepared to leave, the largest entity approached me directly. "You study the old stories," it said. "You understand that some knowledge carries responsibility." I nodded. "The compact between your kind and ours has been broken by those who see the forest as resource rather than relative. More will disappear unless the sacred places are protected. We'll work with the tribal elders," I promised. "We'll advocate for expanded protection of these areas." The tall walker seemed satisfied. As we escorted Timothy out of the restricted zone, the entities faded back into the forest shadows. 3 days later, Timothy Allen was reunited with his family. He underwent extensive debriefing and counseling, but remained adamant that his experience with the tall walkers had been transformative rather than traumatic. The families of the other 3 missing persons were informed that their loved ones had chosen to remain in a remote wilderness area and wished not to be contacted. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was a truth they could accept. The Missing Division's report recommended expanded cooperation with indigenous communities and enhanced protection for areas identified as sacred sites. My folklore research became the basis for new protocols governing investigations in regions with significant indigenous spiritual traditions. I remained with the division, investigating similar cases across the country. Each assignment taught me more about the complex relationship between folklore and reality, between the modern world and older ways of understanding our place in nature. 6 months after North Carolina, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of the restricted zone taken from an impossible height, as if the camera had been positioned in the forest canopy. It showed the circular clearing and the 7 tall walkers standing in formation around 3 human figures who appeared to be thriving in their new environment. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "The compact holds. Thank you." I keep that photograph on my desk as a reminder that some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious, that some disappearances lead not to tragedy but to transformation, and that the old stories survive because they contain truths too important to forget. The tall walkers are still out there, in forests across America, following rules older than our civilization. They guard the boundaries between worlds, protecting sacred spaces and offering sanctuary to those who no longer fit in our modern reality. And sometimes when the boundaries grow thin and the modern world feels too harsh to bear, People choose to cross over into their realm voluntarily. The missing aren't always lost. Sometimes they're exactly where they need to be. My name is Sarah Chen, and until 6 months ago, I was drowning in debt in my cramped studio apartment in Portland, Oregon. Fresh out of college with a degree in anthropology that seemed increasingly worthless, I spent my days serving overpriced coffee to tech workers while my student loan payments consumed most of my paycheck. My favorite things: hiking the Columbia River Gorge, reading folklore collections from my grandmother's library, and playing my acoustic guitar, had become luxuries I could barely afford time for between my two jobs. That's when Harold Vance found me. I was closing the coffee shop on a particularly gray October evening when he walked in, rain dripping from his government-issued coat. He was older, maybe 55, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the room. He ordered black coffee and left a business card with only a phone number. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Your academic work on Pacific Northwest folklore caught our attention. Specifically, your thesis on missing persons cases correlating with indigenous legend patterns." I stared at him, remembering the paper that had earned me nothing but raised eyebrows from professors who preferred their anthropology sanitized of supernatural elements. Whose are people who take such matters seriously? People who understand that some disappearances can't be explained by conventional search and rescue operations. 3 days later, I was on a plane to a classified training facility in rural Virginia, my coffee shop uniform replaced by tactical gear. The organization Harold represented had no official name. We simply called it the department. It existed in the gray spaces between federal agencies tasked with investigating disappearances that exhibited patterns too strange for regular law enforcement. The training was intense: wilderness survival, firearms proficiency, folklore documentation protocols, and something they called entity engagement procedures. I learned that our cases typically involve people who vanished in remote areas under circumstances that defied logical explanation. The missing were often found weeks later with no memory of their absence, or sometimes they weren't found at all. My specialty became the folklore angle. Every region had its stories: Wendigos in the northern forests, the Beast of Bladenboro in North Carolina, the Michigan Dogman. The department had learned that these weren't just campfire tales. They were warning systems, passed down through generations by people who understood that certain places demanded respect or exacted a terrible price. My first assignment took me to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where 3 hikers had vanished from the Hiawatha National Forest over the span of 2 months. Local Ojibwe elders spoke in hushed tones about the Wendigo, not the Hollywood version but something far more ancient and hungry. The missing hikers were all found eventually, but they returned changed, speaking of voices in the wind that promised warmth if they would just keep walking deeper into the trees. Next came Oregon's Cascade Range, where loggers reported tools going missing and strange footprints that appeared overnight. 2 forestry workers had disappeared during the autumn months, their trucks found idling on empty logging roads, doors open, personal belongings scattered as if they had fled in terror. The local Warm Springs tribe had stories about stick Indians, beings that could mimic human voices and lead the unwary into the deep forest. Both workers were eventually located, catatonic and frostbitten, 40 miles from where they'd vanished, with no explanation for how they'd traveled so far. Pennsylvania presented us with the case of the Broad Top Mountain disappearances. 5 hunting parties over 3 years had reported members simply vanishing from their camps at night. The survivors spoke of hearing their friends' voices calling from the darkness, but when they followed the sounds, they found only empty forest. Local German-American communities still told stories of Der Schwarze Mann, the shadow man who collected souls in the mountains. 4 of the 5 missing hunters were recovered alive but traumatized, speaking obsessively about following familiar voices into caves that shouldn't have existed. Wisconsin's Chickamauga National Forest yielded our strangest case yet. Cross-country skiers had been disappearing during the coldest months, their tracks simply ending mid-stride in the snow. The Menominee Nation had legends about ice spirits that could freeze a person's soul before taking their body. 3 skiers were found weeks later, perfectly preserved in ice formations that appeared overnight. their expressions peaceful but their eyes reflecting a terror that suggested they remained conscious during their frozen captivity. But it was North Carolina that would test everything I'd learned. The Great Smoky Mountains had always been a place where people went missing. The Cherokee spoke of the Nunahi, the immortal ones who lived in the shadows between worlds. Modern park rangers attributed the disappearances to the treacherous terrain, sudden weather changes, and the occasional bear encounter. But the pattern was too consistent, too specific. Families would set up camp in designated areas, follow all safety protocols, and still wake to find a member simply gone. No signs of struggle, no tracks leading away from the campsite, nothing disturbed except for the absence of a human being. The missing were typically found days later in locations that should have been impossible to reach. On cliff faces, in underground caverns with no apparent entrances, or sitting peacefully in meadows that existed on no topographical map. That's where Harold sent me in late November, partnered with Detective Eugene Morrison from the National Park Service. Eugene was a 20-year veteran who'd seen enough unexplained disappearances to accept that conventional investigation methods weren't always sufficient. He was tall and weathered, with the kind of steady calm that comes from spending years in the wilderness. "Chen," he said when we met at the Gatlinburg Ranger Station, "I hope your folklore studies included survival training. Where we're going, the old stories aren't just entertainment, they're operational intelligence." Our current case involved the Brennan family, parents and 2 teenage children who'd vanished from a campsite near Cataract Falls 3 days earlier. Their equipment remained undisturbed, their vehicle locked and intact. The only unusual detail was a series of small stone cairns that appeared to lead from their campsite deeper into the forest. Cairns that hadn't been there when rangers had inspected the area the previous week. As Eugene and I prepared to follow the trail of stone markers, I couldn't shake the feeling that this case would be different. The Cherokee stories about the Nunahi weren't just about disappearances. They spoke of people who crossed over into another realm entirely, sometimes by choice, sometimes by accident, and sometimes because something on the other side had decided they belonged there. The forest around Cataract Falls was ancient, thick with rhododendron and mountain laurel that created a canopy so dense it blocked most of the daylight. The stone cairns were subtle, just 3 or 4 rocks balanced carefully, easy to miss unless you knew what to look for. But they formed a clear path that led away from established trails, deeper into the kind of wilderness where the Cherokee had once hidden from soldiers, and where some believed they were hiding still. We followed the cairns for 2 hours, documenting each one with GPS coordinates and photographs. The trail led steadily upward, through terrain that grew increasingly difficult as we climbed. Eugene moved with the careful precision of someone who understood that a twisted ankle in this isolation could mean death, while I focused on recording environmental details that might be relevant to our investigation. The temperature had dropped significantly since we'd left the ranger station, and a thin mist was beginning to settle between the trees. More concerning was the absolute silence. No bird calls, no insect sounds, not even the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The forest felt suspended, as if holding its breath. "Chen," Eugene said quietly, stopping beside the 15th cairn. "Look at this." The stones were arranged differently here, not just balanced, but forming a clear arrow that pointed toward a gap between 2 massive oaks. More importantly, there were footprints in the soft earth beside the cairn. Bare footprints, small enough to belong to a child, but with an odd elongation to the toes that made them appear almost claw-like. I knelt to photograph the prints, noting their depth and clarity. "These are fresh," I said. "Made within the last day, maybe less." "Wrong season for bare feet," Eugene observed. "It's 38 degrees up here." The trail through the oak gap descended sharply into a hollow I didn't recognize from any topographical survey. The mist was thicker here, creating visibility of maybe 20 feet in any direction. But the cairns continued, and now they were accompanied by other markers, small bundles of twigs tied with what looked like sinew hanging from low branches at eye level. I photographed each bundle, recognizing them from Cherokee ethnographic studies. These were trail markers used by medicine people, indicating sacred or dangerous ground. The fact that they appeared to be recently made suggested we weren't just following the Brennan family's path, we were following someone else's deliberate trail. "Eugene," I said, checking my GPS device, "we're not registering on satellite anymore." He examined his own equipment, frowning. "Radio's dead too." Whatever's happening here, it's interfering with electronics. The path leveled out as we entered the hollow proper, and I realized we were walking through what had once been a settlement. Stone foundations protruded from the earth, partially concealed by decades of leaf fall and undergrowth. But these weren't the remains of a Cherokee village. The stonework was too regular, too European in construction. "This isn't on any historical survey," Eugene said, examining the nearest foundation. "Homestead, maybe? But why build this far from water sources?" I was studying the settlement's layout when I heard it. A voice calling from deeper in the hollow. It was faint but unmistakably human, speaking words I couldn't quite distinguish. Eugene heard it too, his hand moving instinctively to his sidearm. We approached the sound carefully, following what had once been a main path between the ruined structures. The voice grew clearer as we advanced, and I realized it was speaking Cherokee, phrases I recognized from my linguistic studies, but in a dialect that seemed archaic, formal. The source of the voice was a circular clearing at the center of the settlement, where a natural spring emerged from the mountainside to form a small pool. Sitting beside the water was a figure that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a Cherokee woman, middle-aged, wearing traditional clothing that looked both ancient and impossibly well preserved. Her hair was braided with beads and feathers, and her skin had the kind of ageless quality that made determining her actual age impossible. She was singing, a water song, I realized, the kind used in purification ceremonies. But what made the scene truly unsettling was what surrounded her. The Brennan family sat in a semicircle facing the woman, their eyes open but vacant, their lips moving silently as if repeating words they couldn't hear. They appeared unharmed but completely unaware of our presence. "Ma'am," Eugene called out, his voice carefully controlled. "I'm with the National Park Service. These people have been reported missing." The woman looked up at us, and her eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire visible portion, like looking into deep water at night. When she smiled, her teeth were too white, too sharp. "They are not missing," she said in accented but perfect English. "They are found. They sought the old paths, and the old paths brought them home." I felt the temperature drop another 10 degrees as she spoke, and my breath began to mist. The folklore accounts rushed through my mind. The Nanahi were said to be helpful spirits, but they operated by different rules, different concepts of time and obligation. They helped those who were lost. But their definition of helping wasn't always what the lost person had intended. "We need to take them back to their camp," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Their family is worried." The woman's black eyes fixed on me, and I felt a pressure in my skull like the onset of a severe headache. "You study the old stories," she said. "You know the price of passage. They called for help, and help was given. Now the debt must be honored." Eugene was reaching for his radio, apparently forgetting it wasn't functional. The Brennan family continued their silent repetition, but I noticed their lips were beginning to turn blue, and their breath was creating clouds of vapor in the suddenly frigid air. "What debt?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "The debt of the lost to the found, the debt of the wanderer to the guide. They will stay until someone takes their place, or until the mountain decides they have given enough." I understood then that we weren't dealing with spirits in the traditional sense, but with something far older. A system of cosmic balance that the Cherokee had learned to respect rather than challenge. The Nanahi weren't malevolent, but they operated by rules that predated human civilization. "I'll stay," I said, surprising myself with the words. "Let them go, and I'll honor their debt." Eugene grabbed my arm. "Chen, no, we'll find another way." But the woman was already shaking her head. "The debt cannot be transferred to the unwilling. It must be chosen freely, with full understanding of the cost." "What cost?" "Time flows differently here. A day in this place is a season in yours. A year here is a lifetime there. They have been here 3 of your days, but they remember 3 of your seasons. If they stay much longer, they will forget your world entirely." The pressure in my skull intensified, and I realized she was showing me something. Images of the Brennan family's experience. From their perspective, they had been wandering lost in the forest for months, growing increasingly desperate and cold, when they encountered the woman by the spring. She had offered them shelter, warmth, and food, asking only that they stay until they were strong enough to find their way home. But her definition of strong enough operated on a different temporal scale. They would never be strong enough to leave because the longer they stayed, the weaker their connection to the outside world became. The only way to free them, the woman continued, is for someone to take their place willingly, or for them to remember strongly enough why they wanted to return that they can break the binding themselves. I looked at the family, the parents holding hands, their faces peaceful but empty, the teenagers staring into the spring as if seeing visions in its depths. They had been calling for help in the wilderness, and help had come, but with strings attached that they hadn't understood until it was too late. Can they hear us? I asked. They hear what they choose to hear. Speak to them of home, of the life they left behind. If their desire to return is stronger than their gratitude for shelter, they may remember the way back. I knelt beside Mrs. Brennan, speaking directly into her ear about her life in Knoxville, her job at the elementary school, her sister's wedding next month, her garden that would need winterizing. Slowly, her eyes began to focus, and she looked at me with growing recognition and horror. How long? She whispered. 3 days, I said. You've been missing for 3 days. One by one, the family members began to remember, their connection to the outside world reasserting itself as they focused on the specific details of their lives. The woman by the spring watched impassively as they stood, their movements stiff and uncertain. You may go, she said, but know that the path remains open. When you are truly lost, when you truly need shelter from the storm, you need only call our names and we will answer. As we led the Brennan family back toward the established trails, following Eugene's compass rather than the cairns, I turned for one last look at the settlement. The woman was gone. The spring was just a natural water source, and the ruined foundations looked like they had been abandoned for decades. But I knew the trail would remain. Somewhere in the database back at headquarters, this location would be marked as a point of interest, a place where the old agreement still held power. And the next time someone went missing in these mountains, we would know where to look and what price we might be asked to pay. The Brennan family recovered fully, though they retained fragmented memories of their time in the hollow that would fade with every passing day. In their official statements, they reported becoming disoriented during a hike and taking shelter in a cave until rescue arrived. The Park Service file would list their disappearance as a standard lost hiker incident, but Eugene and I knew better. And somewhere in the mist-shrouded hollows of the Great Smoky Mountains, the Nunnahi continue to offer shelter to the lost, asking only for stories of home in return, and sometimes for something far more valuable than that.